On my birthday, my niece tossed her red Cosmopolitan directly onto my silk outfit and loudly declared that now I finally looked as cheap as I really was. My mother did not scold her. Instead, she took her side. I just smiled, wiped my face, and walked out. That night, I logged into a corporate portal and canceled my sister's black credit card. But the real shock came at 7 a.m. the next morning when my niece woke up to find her $80,000 Mercedes completely gone. And that was only the first domino to fall. My name is Bethany. I am 34 years old, and for my entire life, my family treated me like the embarrassing working-class relative they had to tolerate. Before I tell you exactly how I legally dismantled their fake wealthy lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever had to endure toxic family members who mistake your silence for weakness. The prime rib at the finest steakhouse in downtown Chicago costs $120. I had barely taken my first bite when a freezing wave of bright red liquid smashed into my chest, soaking through my tailored silk blouse and dripping down my lap. The ice cubes clattered onto my porcelain plate, completely ruining my dinner. I blinked through the stinging alcohol of a spilled Cosmopolitan, looking up to see my 19-year-old niece Kinsley standing over me. She was holding an empty martini glass, a smug, venomous grin plastered across her face. "Oops," Kinsley sneered, her voice carrying across the quiet, dimly lit dining room. Several patrons at nearby tables turned their heads to stare. "Well, now you look as cheap as you really are, Aunt Bethany. Maybe next time do not wear an off-the-rack outfit to a five-star restaurant. You are embarrassing us." My hands gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany table. The sticky red liquid was actively staining a blouse I had bought specifically for this occasion. It was my 34th birthday. I had driven an hour in rush hour traffic just to attend this dinner, a dinner my mother Barbara had insisted we have as a family to celebrate. I looked from Kinsley's gloating face to her parents sitting across the table. My older sister Madison adjusted her heavy designer necklace, a smirk playing on her lips. Beside her sat DeAndre, my African-American brother-in-law, looking immaculate in a custom-tailored suit. He let out a low chuckle, picking up his Scotch glass to take a sip, thoroughly amused by his daughter's blatant disrespect. "Are you going to say anything to her?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. I looked directly at Madison. "Your daughter just intentionally threw a cocktail on me." Madison rolled her eyes, leaning back into the expensive leather booth. "Oh, Bethany, do not be so dramatic. It was clearly an accident. Besides, Kinsley is right. You always show up to these upscale places looking like an accountant who just rolled out of a cubicle. DeAndre is picking up the tab for this entire birthday dinner, so the least you can do is be gracious. I am an accountant, technically speaking. I am a forensic auditor and estate liquidator for high net worth clients. That means I spend my days tracking down hidden assets, exposing tax fraud, and untangling multi-million-dollar estates. My family simply viewed my job as boring working-class labor compared to DeAndre's supposedly glamorous role as a tech executive. They equated my practical lifestyle with poverty, completely unaware of the actual financial power I wielded behind closed doors. They loved to parade their luxury cars and country club memberships, treating me like a charity case, who should be grateful just to sit at their table. I turned my gaze to my mother Barbara. She sat at the head of the table sipping her expensive wine, looking utterly unbothered by the fact that her granddaughter had just assaulted her daughter in a public restaurant. Surely I thought she would intervene. She was the matriarch. She had organized this birthday dinner. But Barbara just frowned at me, visibly irritated. "Bethany, please," my mother sighed, waving her hand dismissively toward the stained floor. "Stop making a scene. You are scratching the floor with your chair. Kinsley is just a teenager expressing herself. Why do you always have to ruin every family gathering with your extreme sensitivity? DeAndre is paying a fortune for this table. Just go home, wash that cheap rag you are wearing, and let us enjoy the rest of the evening in peace." The dismissal hit me, but it did not break me. It illuminated everything perfectly. They had invited me here not to celebrate my birthday, but to use me as a prop, someone to look down upon, so they could feel better about their own fabricated high society lives. Madison wanted an audience for her new jewelry. DeAndre wanted an audience for his wealth. Barbara wanted to bask in the glow of her favorite wealthy daughter. DeAndre flashed his perfect expensive smile. I can cover your valet ticket if you need the cash. Bethany. He offered, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. I did not scream. I did not cry. I picked up my cloth napkin, slowly wiping the red alcohol from my cheek and neck. I looked at Kinsley, who was already turning her attention back to her smartphone, probably preparing to post about her hilarious prank on social media. I looked at Madison, draped in luxury, and DeAndre projecting the image of an untouchable titan of industry. Finally, I looked at my mother, who could not even bear to make eye contact with the daughter she considered a failure. Thank you for the birthday dinner, I said quietly, placing the damp napkin over my ruined plate. Enjoy the meal. I turned and walked out of the elegant dining room, my heels clicking steadily against the hardwood floor. I could feel the stares of the other patrons, but I kept my head high. As I stepped out into the chilly Chicago night air, I did not feel humiliated. I felt a cold, calculating sense of absolute clarity. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully put the poor, boring sister in her place. But as I sat in my practical, reliable sedan and pulled out my iPad from my work bag, I knew something they did not. I knew exactly who funded their entire masquerade, and I was about to shut the whole circus down. The cold leather of my car seat pressed against my back. The air conditioning kicked on, sending a shiver through my wet silk blouse. The sticky smell of cranberry and vodka filled the small space of my sedan. I did not turn the key in the ignition. Instead, I let the silence of the parking garage wash over me. For 34 years, I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had let my mother rewrite reality to suit her favorite child. But tonight, the rules of the game changed. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. The screen lit up with my mother's name. A voice message. I connected the phone to the car speakers and hit play. Her voice echoed through the stereo, sharp and unapologetic. Bethany, I hope you are driving straight home. You completely ruined the mood of the evening. Madison is practically in tears because of your dramatic exit. You need to understand that DeAndre works 80 hours a week running a highly successful tech firm. He provides a magnificent lifestyle for your sister. They have an image to maintain. You showing up in those cheap clothes and acting like a victim over a spilled drink is just unacceptable. DeAndre pays for everything. He is the pillar of this family. Why can you not just be happy for them instead of acting like such a burden? Do not call us until you are ready to apologize to Kinsley. The message ended with a sharp click. I stared at the dashboard. My mother truly believed every word she just said. She genuinely believed DeAndre was the wealthy savior of our family. She believed Madison was a high society elite. And she believed I was nothing but a jealous, struggling working-class accountant. I opened my work bag and pulled out my tablet. The screen glowed in the dark car. I tapped the icon for my corporate financial portal. It was time to show them exactly who was paying for that five-star dinner. I navigated to the corporate accounts section of my estate liquidation firm. As a forensic auditor, I manage millions of dollars in liquidated assets, trust funds, and corporate accounts. My personal wealth was something I kept entirely hidden from my family. They saw my practical car and my modest clothes and assumed I was barely making ends meet. They never bothered to ask what I actually did for a living. I clicked on the profile for my American Express Centurion account, the legendary black card. Right there on the screen, listed as an authorized secondary user, was Madison. 2 years ago, Madison had come to me crying. She claimed DeAndre was restructuring his tech company and their assets were temporarily frozen. She begged me to put her on my corporate card just for emergency groceries and gas until the freeze was lifted. I knew it was a lie, but I agreed to help my sister under the strict condition that she pay off whatever small amount she spent. Of course, the spending never stopped. The emergency groceries turned into $1,000 spa days, designer shoes, and extravagant dinners. I let it happen. I paid the bills, silently gathering the data, building a meticulous record of their fraudulent lifestyle. I knew DeAndre was drowning in debt. I knew his tech company had quietly laid him off 8 months ago. But my mother refused to see the truth. She worshipped the illusion. I stared at Madison's name on the screen. She was probably sitting at that steakhouse right now, preparing to hand the waiter that very same black card to pay for my birthday dinner. They were going to use my own money to buy the meal they just kicked me out of. My finger hovered over the red button on the screen. Revoke access. I pressed it. A confirmation prompt popped up asking if I was sure I wanted to permanently revoke all privileges for this user. I tapped yes. The authorization was instantly terminated. The card in Madison's designer purse was now nothing more than a useless piece of plastic. I could only imagine the look on DeAndre's face when the waiter returned to the table and loudly announced the card had been declined. But cutting off their dinner funds was not enough. Kinsley had thrown a drink on me because she felt untouchable. She felt untouchable because she drove an $80,000 Mercedes G-Wagon to her college classes, looking down on everyone she passed. I closed the banking portal and opened a commercial fleet tracking application. A map of Chicago appeared on the screen. I typed in a specific vehicle identification number. A pulsing blue dot appeared on the map, parked precisely in the valet lot of the steakhouse. Kinsley loved to brag about the car her wealthy father bought for her graduation. What she did not know was that DeAndre's credit score had been absolutely decimated 3 years ago. No bank in the country would finance a bicycle for him, let alone a luxury SUV. He had come to me in secret, begging me to use my corporate LLC to secure the financing. He promised to make the monthly payments directly to my company. For the first few months he did. Then the payments stopped. I had been paying for Kinsley's prized vehicle out of my own pocket for over a year. The LLC, solely controlled by me, was the legal and absolute owner of that Mercedes. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I frequently used for my estate liquidation business. A dispatcher answered on the second ring. "This is Bethany," I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. "I need a priority repossession, commercial account." I gave the dispatcher the license plate number, the make and model, and the current GPS coordinates. "I want it picked up by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning," I instructed. "It will likely be parked in the driveway of the residential address on file. Do not knock on the door. Do not engage with the residents. Just hook the vehicle up and bring it to the secure holding lot." The dispatcher confirmed the order. "We will have a tow truck out there at dawn. Consider it done." I hung up the phone and placed it on the passenger seat. The engine roared to life as I turned the key. The heater finally blasted warm air, drying the sticky alcohol on my silk blouse. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking garage, merging into the glowing city traffic. My mother had demanded that I go home, so I would not embarrass them further. She wanted me to disappear so they could continue playing their game of wealthy make-believe. They thought my silence at the dinner table was a surrender. They mistook my lack of screaming for weakness. They did not realize that a forensic auditor does not scream. A forensic auditor simply cuts off the supply. The financial life support I had secretly provided for years was officially disconnected. As I drove back to my quiet, practical home, I felt a deep, satisfying calm settle over me. I went to my bathroom, peeled off the ruined silk blouse, and tossed it directly into the trash can. I washed my face, brushed my teeth, and climbed into my comfortable bed. I set my alarm for 7 o'clock the next morning. I knew exactly what was going to happen when the sun came up, and I wanted to be wide awake for the fireworks. The interface of the financial portal loaded with a crisp chime. I bypassed my primary accounts and navigated straight to the subsidiary ledger. There it was, account number ending in 4109, American Express Centurion, the legendary black card. Under the primary account holder, my name sat in bold letters. Right below it, the authorized secondary user read Madison Caldwell. 2 years ago, Madison had shown up at my modest apartment in tears. She spun a frantic story about DeAndre restructuring his tech firm, claiming their assets were temporarily frozen by the SEC due to a minor filing error. She begged me to issue a corporate card in her name just for basic groceries and gas until the freeze lifted. I knew it was a complete fabrication. The SEC does not freeze personal checking accounts for routine corporate restructuring, but I agreed anyway. I wanted the data. I wanted a front row seat to their financial reality. The basic groceries immediately morphed into charges at luxury boutiques, five-star resorts, and $1,000 dinners. I paid the balance in full every month, saying absolutely nothing. I treated it as a business expense, an investment in leverage. My mother adored boasting about Madison's limitless budget, completely blind to the fact that her less successful daughter was quietly underwriting the entire illusion. I stared at Madison's name on the glowing screen. Right now, she was likely ordering another bottle of vintage wine at the steakhouse, entirely confident that my money would cover the tab. I tapped the settings gear next to her name. A red button materialized on the screen. Revoke access. I pressed it. A confirmation dialog box appeared warning me that this action was immediate and irreversible for the secondary user. I firmly tapped confirm. The screen refreshed. Madison's name vanished from the authorized list. Her heavy metal card was now just a useless, deactivated piece of titanium. I pictured the waiter returning to their table in 20 minutes, leaning down to discreetly inform DeAndre that the card had been declined. The sheer panic that would wash over Madison's face was almost enough to make me laugh out loud. But cutting off their dinner fund was merely a warm-up. I closed the banking application and opened my commercial fleet tracking software. A detailed map of the greater Chicago area populated the screen. I typed in a specific vehicle identification number. A pulsing blue dot immediately appeared on the map, currently stationary at the steakhouse valet lot. Kinsley loved to flaunt her matte black Mercedes G-Wagon. She drove it to her Ivy League campus like a crown, looking down on her peers and treating valet attendants like peasants. She firmly believed her father bought it for her as a reward for simply existing. The truth was far more pathetic. 3 years ago, DeAndre's credit score had completely tanked. He could not secure a loan for a bicycle, let alone an $80,000 luxury SUV. Desperate to maintain his image as a wealthy tech titan for his daughter's high school graduation, he came to me in secret. He begged me to use my corporate LLC to secure the financing, promising he would transfer the monthly payments directly to my company account. For the first 6 months, he kept his word. Then the transfers became sporadic. A year ago, they stopped entirely. I never chased him for the money. I just silently covered the payments myself. By doing so, I kept the title of the vehicle firmly under the name of my estate liquidation firm. Legally, the G-Wagon belonged to me. I watched the blue dot on my screen. It began to move, traveling north toward the affluent suburbs where they lived. They were heading home. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact I used frequently for corporate asset recoveries. I tapped the name and held the phone to my ear. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Mike's Towing and Recovery. Mike, it is Bethany, I said, keeping my tone strictly professional. I need a priority repossession early tomorrow morning. Commercial account. Hey, Bethany, Mike replied, his tone shifting to business. You got it. What is the target and where is it sitting? It is a matte black Mercedes G-Wagon, year 2023, I instructed. I read off the license plate and the VIN. It is currently en route to a residential address in Oak Brook. I will text you the exact location. I need your team there at exactly 6 a.m. tomorrow. Priority 1. Oak Brook. Mike whistled into the receiver. Fancy neighborhood. Do you want us to knock and serve the paperwork first? Absolutely not, I said, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Do not knock. Do not ring the doorbell. Do not engage with the residents if they come outside. Just hook the vehicle up, secure it, and tow it directly to your impound lot. I hold the legal title, which I will forward to your office right now. Understood, Mike said. We will be in and out before they even finish their morning coffee. Consider it done. I ended the call and placed the phone in the passenger seat. The heater in my car was finally fighting back the Chicago chill, but the cold focus in my mind remained absolute. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking garage. My mother had ordered me to go home and change, so I would not embarrass them further. She wanted me out of sight so they could continue living their fantasy without the ugly reminder of reality sitting at their table. For years, they had mistaken my silence for submission. They thought my lack of reaction meant I was weak. They were about to learn that a forensic auditor does not throw tantrums. An auditor simply cuts off the supply. As I drove through the neon-lit streets toward my quiet home, a deep sense of satisfaction settled into my bones. The financial life support I had quietly provided for my family was completely disconnected. I set my mental clock for dawn. I knew exactly what kind of chaos would erupt when the sun came up, and I was fully prepared to watch their empire of lies crumble to the ground. My alarm never had the chance to ring at 7 o'clock. At exactly 6:45, the violent buzzing of my phone vibrating against the wooden nightstand jolted me awake. I rolled over and picked up the device. The screen was an absolute wall of notifications. There were 11 missed calls from Kinsley, 6 from Madison, and 4 from my mother. I unlocked the phone and tapped the voicemail icon. I selected the first message from Kinsley and hit play, turning the volume up. "My car is gone," Kinsley screamed into the receiver. Her voice was shrill, accompanied by the sound of her hyperventilating and her heavy footsteps stomping on pavement. "Someone stole my G-Wagon right out of the driveway. Did you call the police on me for the drink, you psycho? I know you did something. Call me back right now or I am calling the cops on you." I deleted the voicemail with a quick swipe of my thumb. Next, I opened my text messages. Madison had sent a barrage of texts starting at 6:30. The progression of her panic was highly entertaining. First text: "Bethany, why is my card declining? Fix this immediately." Second text: "Bethany, I am standing at the front desk of the Waldorf Astoria Spa, and they are telling me the Centurion card is invalid. I am with the girls. This is humiliating. Turn it back on." Third text: "You petty, jealous little witch. You froze my card over a spilled drink. Call the bank and fix this right now before DeAndre gets involved." I smiled, tossing the phone onto the bed. I did not reply. Instead, I walked into my kitchen, ground some fresh coffee beans, and started a pot of French press. The morning sun was just starting to filter through the blinds of my kitchen window. It was a beautiful, quiet morning in my neighborhood. The contrast between the absolute peace of my home and the sheer panic tearing through their massive suburban mansion was delicious. They honestly believed this was a petty sibling rivalry. Madison thought I had simply placed a temporary hold on the credit card out of spite. Kinsley genuinely believed someone had hot-wired her luxury vehicle and stolen it in the dead of night. Neither of them possessed the financial literacy to understand what an asset repossession looked like. They were entirely oblivious to the legal storm that had just made landfall on their doorstep. I poured my coffee into a mug, taking a slow, appreciative sip. I savored the rich, dark roast. I knew they would not wait for a text message reply. They were creatures of immediate gratification, accustomed to snapping their fingers and having the world bend to their will. When I did not answer, they would inevitably bring the fight to me. Right on cue, a heavy, aggressive pounding rattled my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the frantic, entitled pounding of people who believed they owned every space they occupied. I walked down the hallway and glanced at the digital security monitor mounted on the wall. The live camera feed displayed my front porch. Madison, DeAndre, and my mother Barbara were standing there huddled tightly together in the crisp morning air. Madison was hiding behind massive designer sunglasses, her hair pulled into a messy bun, clearly having skipped her usual 2 hours of morning grooming. Barbara was glaring at the door with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pursed in absolute fury. DeAndre stood slightly ahead of them, puffing his chest out in a ridiculous display of aggressive posturing. The doorbell began to ring incessantly, echoing through my quiet house. I took another sip of my coffee, adjusted the lapels of my silk robe, and calmly unlocked the deadbolt. I swung the door open. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Madison shrieked the second the door cracked open. She pushed past DeAndre, stepping aggressively toward my threshold. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to have my card declined in front of my friends? I had to pretend the bank flagged it for a suspicious international purchase. Turn the card back on right now." Before I could even address my sister, my mother stepped up, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. "You have gone completely insane, Bethany," Barbara scolded, her voice dripping with venom. "Freezing your sister's emergency card over a clumsy mistake at a birthday dinner. You are acting like a petulant child and ignoring our calls. We have been trying to reach you for an hour. I leaned against the door frame, holding my coffee mug with both hands. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. It was not a clumsy mistake, Mom, I replied softly. It was an intentional assault. And Madison, it is not your card. It is my corporate account. You are no longer an authorized user. Your access is permanently revoked. DeAndre stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Madison's shoulder to pull her back. He puffed out his chest, trying to look like the intimidating corporate executive he pretended to be. His jaw was tight and his eyes burned with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Listen to me very carefully, Bethany," DeAndre growled, dropping his voice to what he likely thought was a menacing register. "You can play your little financial games with the credit card if you want to be petty, but you crossed a massive legal line this morning." I tilted my head, feigning mild curiosity. "A legal line, DeAndre? Please explain." "Kinsley's car is missing," he barked, his face turning red. "It was taken right out of our driveway before sunrise. We checked the security cameras. A commercial tow truck pulled up, hooked up the G-Wagon, and drove off with it. We know you did it. You used your shady liquidator contacts to steal my daughter's vehicle. You are a thief," Madison yelled from behind him, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You stole an $80,000 car out of sheer jealousy." My mother shook her head in utter disgust. "I cannot believe I raised a daughter who would stoop to grand theft auto over a spilled cocktail. You need to return that car this exact second, Bethany, or we are calling the police. We will have you arrested and thrown in jail. We are not playing games with you anymore." I looked at the three of them standing on my porch, practically vibrating with self-righteous fury. They were threatening me with the police. They were threatening to expose me to the law, completely unaware that the law was exactly what I had used to dismantle them. I took one final slow sip of my coffee. "Call them," I said, my voice completely deadpan. "Call the police right now, DeAndre. In fact, let us go into my kitchen. I have some paperwork you are going to want to show the officers when they arrive." They followed me into the kitchen. My mother scoffed at my laminate countertops, a sharp contrast to her imported Italian marble. DeAndre stood tall, his jaw set, his phone already gripped tightly in his hand. Madison stood beside him, her arms crossed, glaring at me as if I were a rebellious teenager who had just missed curfew. I set my coffee mug down on the island. I walked over to the discreet keypad safe installed inside my pantry. I punched in the 6-digit code, the heavy steel door unlatching with a solid clunk. I reached inside and pulled out 2 thick manila folders. "I do not know what kind of stunt you think you are pulling," DeAndre barked, taking a heavy step toward the kitchen island. "But I am not playing. I am calling my corporate lawyers right now. You can't steal my daughter's car." I turned around and walked back to the island. I lifted the first folder and dropped it flat onto the counter. The sharp slap of the thick paper against the granite echoed in the quiet kitchen. "Call them, DeAndre," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Tell them you want to sue the LLC that owns that car. The LLC, I solely control which bought that car because your credit score was destroyed 3 years ago." DeAndre froze. The phone in his hand suddenly looked very heavy. The aggressive posture melted from his shoulders in an instant, replaced by a rigid, terrified stiffness. Madison frowned, looking from the folder to her husband. "DeAndre, what is she talking about? What LLC?" I did not wait for him to invent a lie. I opened the folder and slid the official vehicle title across the counter toward my sister. "Read it yourself, Madison. The owner of the vehicle is Zenith Liquidations. That is my company. 3 years ago, your husband came to me begging for help. He had defaulted on multiple high-interest loans, trying to fund a lifestyle you could not afford. No bank would finance Kinsley's graduation present. I bought it. He promised to pay me back monthly. He stopped paying exactly 1 year ago. Legally, I just repossessed my own property." Madison stared at the document. Her eyes scanned the official state seal, my company name, and my signature. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble. She turned to DeAndre, her voice rising in panic. "Is this true? You told me you bought it outright? You told me you paid cash." DeAndre swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. He could not make eye contact with his wife. He stared fixedly at the granite countertop, a bead of sweat forming at his temple despite the cool morning air. And while we are discussing your finances, I continued dropping the second folder onto the island. Let us talk about your emergency grocery card. I opened the file and pushed the American Express Centurion contract toward her. The paper detailed the primary account holder, my name, and the secondary authorized user, Madison Caldwell. Next to it, I placed a printed spreadsheet. It was a line-by-line itemization of every single purchase she had made over the last 2 years. You came to me crying about a temporary SEC freeze, I said, my tone clinical, completely devoid of sympathy. You needed gas and groceries. Instead, you spent my money on Louis Vuitton bags, weekend trips to Napa, and five-star dinners. You used my money to buy the very dinner you kicked me out of last night. DeAndre handles the finances, Madison stammered, stepping away from the counter as if the documents were physically burning her. He said the freeze was taking longer than expected. He said his tech firm was just navigating a massive merger. I let out a short, hollow laugh. Madison, he does not have a tech firm. He has not had one for 8 months. He was quietly let go last October. He has been leaving the house every morning in a suit to sit in a coffee shop while I funded your entire masquerade. The silence that followed was absolute. The hum of my refrigerator was the only sound in the room. Madison looked at DeAndre, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. The man she paraded around as a titan of industry, the man who supposedly provided her untouchable status, was entirely empty. He had nothing. He was nothing. The luxury, the country club memberships, the cars, all of it was a house of cards financed by the sister she constantly belittled. DeAndre's face was ashen. The intimidation he had brought into my home was gone, replaced by the pathetic realization that his greatest secret was now sitting on my kitchen counter in plain text. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of excuse, but no words came out. I watched them shatter. It was exactly as I had predicted. The structural integrity of their fake lives had zero foundation. I had just pulled the single load-bearing pin, and the entire edifice was collapsing right in front of me. But I had underestimated the depth of my mother's delusion. Barbara stepped forward, physically pushing Madison aside to stand directly in front of me. Her face was flushed dark red, the veins in her neck standing out against her skin. She slammed her hand down on the documents, refusing to even look at the numbers printed on the pages. "Stop this right now," Barbara hissed, her voice vibrating with irrational fury. "I do not know what kind of fake papers you printed out in your little home office, Bethany, but I am not falling for it." I blinked, genuinely surprised. "Mom, the title is certified. The bank statements are right there. DeAndre is standing right next to you, completely unable to deny it." "He is in shock because of your vicious accusations," Barbara snapped, pointing a trembling finger inches from my nose. "You have always been jealous of your sister. From the day she married DeAndre, you could not stand that she had a successful, wealthy husband while you sat alone balancing spreadsheets. You fabricated this entire scenario just to ruin her life because you are bitter and alone." "Barbara, look at him," I said, gesturing to DeAndre, who was physically shrinking into himself. Ask him right now where he works." "I will do no such thing," my mother practically spat. "DeAndre is a provider. He is a good man. You are a vindictive, pathetic liar. You hired some thug to steal your niece's car to force this ridiculous confrontation. You think throwing some forged documents on a counter makes you powerful? It just proves how desperate you are for attention." I stared at her. The sheer magnitude of her denial was breathtaking. Presented with absolute, undeniable, legally binding proof that her golden child's life was a total fraud, she chose to double down on the illusion. She would rather believe her practical, hardworking daughter was a sociopathic mastermind than admit she had spent years worshipping a broke, unemployed liar. "I am warning you, Bethany," Barbara continued, her voice rising to a frantic pitch as she leaned across the island. "You will return that car today. You will call the bank and fix whatever trick you played on Madison's card. If you do not fix this right now, I will personally see to it that you are destroyed." The echo of my mother's threat hung in the pristine air of my kitchen. Her chest heaved with the exertion of her screaming, her face an uncharacteristic shade of mottled crimson. For a woman who spent her entire life meticulously curating an image of effortless aristocratic grace, Barbara looked entirely unhinged. She stood with her manicured hands curled into tight fists at her sides, refusing to look down at the granite island where the undeniable proof of her golden child's failure rested. I did not flinch. I did not shrink back or apologize the way I had for 3 decades. I picked up my coffee mug, taking a slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast tasted exceptionally good this morning. "Destroy me with what exactly, Mom?" I asked, keeping my voice pitched at a conversational level. "Are you going to destroy me with DeAndre's negative bank balances? Or perhaps Madison can destroy me with her collection of empty designer handbags?" I stepped closer to the island, tapping the thick manila folder containing the American Express records. "You have spent the last 10 years using me as a punchline," I said, my tone hardening. "You paraded them around at every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering, demanding I show gratitude to a man whose lavish lifestyle I was secretly subsidizing. You called me cheap. You called me a burden. I am not the one whose life is about to be destroyed today. The only thing being destroyed here is your delusion." Barbara's eyes narrowed into dark, venomous slits. The flush of panicked embarrassment morphed into a cold, calculated glare. She adjusted her posture, smoothing the front of her cashmere cardigan, and lifting her chin, attempting to reclaim her position as the untouchable matriarch. If she could not win the argument with facts, she would resort to the one tactic that had always guaranteed my compliance. She was going to play her ultimate trump card. "You think you are so incredibly smart with your little accounting tricks?" Barbara sneered, stepping up to the edge of the marble counter. "You think controlling one car and freezing one credit card makes you the power center of this family? You are nothing but a glorified bookkeeper, Bethany. You seem to have forgotten who controls the real wealth." She leaned forward, her voice dropping into a harsh, commanding register that immediately transported me back to my childhood. It was the exact tone she used whenever I stepped out of line. "I built the foundation you stand on," Barbara spat. "I am the one who holds the purse strings. Have you forgotten what happens when you cross me? I cut off your college tuition the very minute you refused to major in corporate law. I withheld the down payment for this pathetic little house because you refused to buy in the gated community I chose for you. I let you take out high-interest loans for your emergency appendectomy just to teach you a lesson about financial independence. I have controlled your access to our family's wealth your entire life, and I can erase you from it with a single phone call." Madison, who had been quietly weeping near the refrigerator, suddenly stood up straighter. She wiped her smeared mascara carefully, a smug, vindictive smirk slowly returning to her tear-stained face. DeAndre lifted his head, his posture shifting from a defeated, unemployed fraud back to an expectant parasite. "I am the primary beneficiary and the sole executor of your grandfather's estate," Barbara announced, slamming her palm flat against the kitchen island. "That trust fund holds over $12 million in liquid assets and real estate. I kept you in the will out of pity. I thought eventually you would learn your place and show some respect. But after this little stunt this morning, you are completely done." She pointed a rigid finger directly at my chest. "I am driving back to my house right now," she declared. "I am calling Arthur Pendleton. I am instructing him to cut you out entirely. You will not see a single dime of the family trust. Madison and Kinsley will inherit your portion. DeAndre will receive the capital he needs to launch his next massive venture. We will ensure that this family prospers, and you will be left with absolutely nothing but your spreadsheets and your spite." The threat was intended to be a fatal shot. For 34 years, my grandfather's vast estate had been the invisible leash wrapped tightly around my neck. It was the ultimate tool of compliance, the weapon my mother wielded to force my attendance at dinners, my silence during insults, and my submission to her blatant favoritism. It was the purest manifestation of her transactional love. I looked at the three of them standing in my kitchen. I looked at the sheer, unadulterated greed illuminating my sister's face. I looked at DeAndre practically salivating at the mention of $12 million, already calculating how he could siphon those funds to resurrect his dead career. Finally, I looked at my mother, radiating a triumphant, arrogant superiority. They truly believed they had won. They thought my mother had just swooped in like an avenging angel to rescue their fabricated empire and put the working-class sister back in her miserable place. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the familiar, suffocating childhood panic of being discarded and unloved. Instead, a low, genuine chuckle escaped my throat. I pressed my lips together, trying to suppress it, but the absolute magnificent irony of the situation was simply too rich to contain. The chuckle blossomed into a full, unabashed laugh that echoed brightly off the tile floors and stainless steel appliances. Barbara recoiled, her triumphant smirk faltering into a mask of pure confusion. Madison took a hesitant step back. "Are you having a nervous breakdown, Bethany?" My mother demanded, her voice wavering with uncertainty. "Do you find your complete financial ruin funny?" I stopped laughing. I placed both hands flat on the cool granite island and leaned in close, a chilling, predatory smile spreading across my face. "Are you sure about that, Mom? Have you checked with the estate lawyer recently?" My mother's face went entirely slack. The triumphant sneer she had worn just seconds prior dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. She stared at me, her eyes darting frantically as her brain tried to process my absolute lack of fear. I was supposed to be cowering. I was supposed to be begging for forgiveness, terrified of losing my share of my grandfather's massive $12 million estate. Instead, I was looking at her with nothing but profound pity. "Get in the car!" Barbara hissed, her voice vibrating with a sudden panicked urgency. She turned on her heel, her designer heels clicking sharply against the kitchen tile. "We are going to Mitchell's office right this exact minute. Madison, DeAndre, come with me. Bethany, you will follow us. I am going to end this today." She did not wait for a response. She marched out of my front door, dialing her phone with aggressive jabs of her thumb. Madison and DeAndre scrambled after her like obedient disciples, eager to witness my financial execution. DeAndre shot me one last venomous glare, trying to mask his own terror with false bravado. I simply picked up my car keys from the counter and followed them out into the crisp morning air. The drive into the city took 45 minutes. I drove my own vehicle, enjoying the quiet hum of the engine and the absolute serenity of knowing exactly what awaited them. I did not need to guess what was happening in my mother's luxury SUV ahead of me. Barbara was undoubtedly ranting, building a fortress of denial, while Madison and DeAndre calculated how quickly they could spend my revoked inheritance. We arrived at the imposing glass and steel high-rise that housed Mitchell, Sterling, and Vance. Arthur Mitchell had been my grandfather's closest confidant and the senior estate lawyer for 4 decades. His office was a testament to generational wealth. The walls were paneled in rich mahogany, the floors covered in thick Persian rugs that absorbed the sound of our footsteps. Barbara did not stop at the reception desk. She marched straight down the hallway, throwing open the heavy double doors to Mitchell's private corner office. "Arthur," Barbara barked, interrupting whatever the elderly lawyer had been reading. She planted herself directly in front of his massive oak desk. "I need emergency documents drafted right now. I am invoking my executive authority over the family trust. I want Bethany removed as a beneficiary entirely. Every single asset, every property, and every liquid account is to be diverted exclusively to Madison and her family." Mitchell slowly took off his reading glasses. He was a distinguished man in his late 60s, with sharp silver hair and a demeanor carved from decades of handling hysterical wealthy families. He looked at Barbara. Then he looked past her, his eyes meeting mine as I calmly stepped into the office and closed the double doors behind me. "Sit down, Barbara," Mitchell said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I will not sit down," my mother shrieked, slamming her hand onto the polished wood of his desk. "Did you not hear me? She has completely lost her mind. She is playing financial games with Madison. She stole Kinsley's car. I will not allow a thief to benefit from my father's legacy. Drop the disinheritance papers right now. I will sign them today." Madison stepped up beside our mother, crossing her arms defensively. "You heard her, Arthur. Bethany has proven herself completely unstable. She is a liability to the family reputation. The trust needs to be protected from her." DeAndre hovered near the door, puffing his chest out. We expect this handled swiftly, he added, trying to sound like a commanding executive despite wearing a wrinkled polo shirt. We have significant investments pending, and we need to clarify the estate's capital distribution. I remained silent. I walked over to the leather armchair in the corner of the room, sat down gracefully, and crossed my legs. Mitchell let out a long, heavy sigh. It was not a sigh of frustration. It was a sigh of profound, devastating pity. He looked at my mother as if she were a delusional child throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. He opened his top desk drawer and pulled out a heavy ring of brass keys. "Barbara." Mitchell began, his tone startlingly gentle. "I cannot draft those papers." My mother recoiled as if she had been slapped. "What do you mean you cannot draft them? I am the primary beneficiary. I am the executor of the estate. I pay your retainer. You will do exactly as I instruct, or I will fire this entire firm and find a lawyer who knows how to follow directions." Mitchell stood up. He walked over to the massive fireproof wall safe tucked behind a row of law books. "You can certainly try to find another firm, Barbara, but no lawyer in this state can execute the orders you are giving me." "Why the hell not?" Madison demanded, her voice shrill and aggressive. She stepped aggressively toward the desk. "Why are you disobeying my mother? She is in charge. She dictates the terms of the trust. If she says Bethany is out, Bethany is out. Do your job." Mitchell punched a code into the keypad, turned the heavy brass wheel, and pulled the steel door open. He reached inside and extracted a massive leather-bound binder. The spine was incredibly thick, sealed with official legal ribbons and stamped with the state seal. He carried the heavy binder back to his desk and placed it gently on the center of the table. The dull thud of the binder hitting the wood seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Mitchell rested his hands flat on top of the leather cover. He looked directly at my sister, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. "Because Madison," Mitchell said, his voice echoing with absolute finality, "your mother does not control the estate. She never did." The room went completely terrifyingly silent. The arrogant sneer on Madison's face vanished. DeAndre physically took a step backward, bumping into the closed office door. My mother froze, staring at the leather binder as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. "What are you talking about?" Barbara whispered, the manic energy draining from her body in a single instant. "My father left the entire estate in my care. I have the documents. I received the quarterly statements. I authorized the distributions." Mitchell shook his head slowly. "You receive an allowance, Barbara. An allowance dictated by a highly specific conditional set of parameters established by your father 3 years before his passing. You have never held executive control over the principal capital. You have never possessed the legal authority to alter the beneficiary structure." "That is a lie," Barbara gasped, her voice trembling. "I am his only living daughter. Who else would he put in charge? Who else has the authority?" I smiled, resting my hands comfortably in my lap. I watched the dawn of absolute horror wash over my mother's face as Mitchell slowly turned his gaze away from her and locked eyes with me. "Your father knew exactly who possessed the business acumen to protect his legacy," Mitchell said quietly. "He transferred absolute executive control of the trust, the real estate portfolio, and the corporate voting shares a decade ago." Mitchell patted the heavy binder once more. "I think it is time we read the actual terms of the trust." Mitchell flipped open the heavy leather cover. The crisp sound of thick archival paper turning echoed through the quiet office. Barbara stood frozen, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. "Before your grandfather passed away, he initiated a comprehensive audit of his accounts." Mitchell began, his voice carrying the calm, steady weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. "He did not tell you about it, Barbara. He hired an independent forensic accountant because he noticed alarming discrepancies. He saw the massive, unexplained withdrawals. He saw the extravagant loans issued to Madison that were never repaid. He tracked the sudden liquidations of reliable blue-chip stocks money that was instantly diverted to cover your designer renovations, your luxury vacations, and your exorbitant country club dues." My mother's face drained of color. She gripped the edge of the mahogany desk so tightly, her knuckles turned white. "I was maintaining our social standing." Barbara hissed, her voice dropping into a desperate defensive register. We are a prominent family. We have an image to uphold. My father understood that. He wanted us to look successful. Your father wanted to build a legacy, Mitchell corrected sharply. He watched you hemorrhage generational wealth to fund a lifestyle built entirely on vanity and reckless consumption. He realized that if he left you in charge as the primary executor, you and Madison would bankrupt the entire family within 5 years. So he took immediate permanent action. Mitchell ran his index finger down a dense paragraph of legal text. He stripped you of all executive power, Mitchell stated. He moved every single asset, the stock portfolios, the commercial properties downtown, and the residential real estate into an irrevocable blind trust. You were placed on a strict, unalterable monthly stipend. It is a generous allowance, Barbara, which is why you never questioned the structural change. But it is entirely fixed. You cannot touch the principal capital. You cannot leverage the real estate. You own absolutely nothing outright. Madison let out a loud, mocking scoff. She tossed her hair over her shoulder and rolled her eyes. So what? Madison sneered, looking around the room as if Mitchell had just delivered a completely meaningless speech. Grandpa panicked and put some stuffy wealth management firm in charge of the big accounts. Big deal. We will just fire the manager. We will sue the firm, break the trust, and put Mom back in control where she belongs. You work for us, Arthur. We can fire you too. Mitchell did not even blink. He looked at my sister with a mixture of fatigue and utter disdain. You cannot fire the trustee, Madison, Mitchell explained, speaking slowly, as if addressing a particularly stubborn toddler. The trust is irrevocable. It cannot be altered, broken, or contested by any beneficiary. Furthermore, the trustee is not a faceless wealth management firm. Your grandfather was very specific about who possessed the discipline, the financial literacy, and the integrity to protect his life's work. Mitchell turned his gaze away from my mother and sister. He looked directly across the room at me. He specifically listed the assets placed under this trust. Mitchell continued, his voice echoing in the stillness of the office. $12 million in liquid capital, the commercial high-rises in the financial district, and all residential real estate holdings. That includes the 6-bedroom custom-built estate in the suburbs currently occupied by Madison and DeAndre Caldwell. DeAndre's head snapped up. Your grandfather appointed Bethany as the sole absolute trustee of the entire estate, Mitchell declared. She does not just balance the books. She owns the house you sleep in. She controls the ground you walk on. Her authority is total and final. The silence that slammed into the room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on the mahogany walls and the Persian rugs. That is a lie, Madison suddenly shrieked. Her voice shattered the quiet, shrill, and frantic. She lunged forward, slamming her hands onto Mitchell's desk, her eyes wide with manic denial. That is a complete and utter lie. Grandpa would never do that. She is a glorified bookkeeper. She is a boring, pathetic loser who sits at home alone. He would never give her everything. He loved me. I was his favorite. She spun around, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me. You forged this, Madison screamed, spittle flying from her lips. You paid Arthur off. You created a fake company to steal my car, you froze my credit card, and now you are trying to steal my house. I will have you arrested. I will have you thrown in a federal prison. I remained perfectly still in my leather armchair. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the reality of her situation crash down around her. DeAndre did not join his wife screaming. He did not puff out his chest or threaten me with his imaginary corporate lawyers. Instead, he stepped backward. He moved slowly, almost mechanically, until his back hit the paneled wall of the office. He looked physically ill. The warm brown of his skin had turned a sickening ashen gray. A fine sheen of sweat coated his forehead, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. I could practically see the gears grinding in his head as the absolute horror of his reality set in. He was an unemployed fraud who had spent the last 8 months pretending to go to work. His luxury car, the symbol of his fake success, had just been legally repossessed by my company. The unlimited black card his wife used to fund their daily extravagance was my corporate account. And now the massive suburban mansion he used to project an image of untouchable wealth was officially controlled by the sister-in-law he had relentlessly mocked and belittled. He had nothing. He owned nothing. He was a squatter living entirely within the borders of my empire. DeAndre reached up and tugged at the collar of his shirt, gasping as if the air in the room had suddenly thinned. He looked at Barbara, who was staring blankly at the floor, completely paralyzed by the destruction of her lifelong illusion of power. He looked at Madison, who was still raving and pounding on the desk, looking completely unhinged. Then DeAndre looked at me. The arrogant, entitled sneer was entirely gone. His eyes were wide, dark, and filled with a desperate, suffocating panic. He stepped away from the wall, abandoning his wife and my mother. He walked across the room, stopping a few feet away from my chair. He swallowed hard, his voice dropping into a hoarse, trembling whisper. "Bethany." DeAndre pleaded, his hands open and palms facing upward in a gesture of total surrender. "We need to talk. Just you and me. Please, I need a private word." I stepped out of the heavy mahogany doors of Arthur Mitchell's office, leaving the chaotic echoes of my mother and sister behind. The hallway was hushed, lined with sound-absorbing Persian runners and tasteful landscape oil paintings. DeAndre practically dragged me by the elbow into a small, empty alcove near the water cooler. He released me immediately, running both his hands over his shaved head. The man standing in front of me was entirely unrecognizable. The custom-tailored Italian suit suddenly looked 3 sizes too big, hanging off a frame that had deflated under the crushing weight of reality. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. "Bethany," DeAndre gasped, his voice cracking. "You have to help me. You have to fix this." I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms over my chest. I surveyed him with the same detached, clinical precision I used when liquidating a bankrupt corporate asset. "Fix what, DeAndre?" I asked softly. "You just spent the morning threatening me with the police. You stood in my kitchen and accused me of grand theft auto. Why on earth would I help you fix anything?" He dropped his gaze to the floor. He could not look me in the eye. The shame radiating from him was palpable, a foul stench that completely overpowered his expensive cologne. "I lied," he whispered, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a frantic, desperate rush. "I lied about the tech firm. I was let go 8 months ago. The board forced me out. They handed me a miserable severance package and locked me out of the building. I have not had a paycheck since October." I tilted my head, feigning mild curiosity. "And you simply forgot to mention this minor detail to your wife. You know what Madison is like?" DeAndre pleaded, stepping closer, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. "You know how she spends. The country club dues, the private school tuition for Kinsley, the constant renovations on the house, the designer clothes. She burns through cash faster than I could ever earn it. If I told her I was unemployed, she would have left me. She would have destroyed me socially. I had to keep up appearances. I had to maintain the image. So you let her drain my corporate account," I stated factually. "You let her think the SEC froze your assets while you quietly lived off my money. That was only supposed to be a temporary bridge," he insisted, his voice rising in panic. "I had interviews lined up. I was pitching startups. I just needed a few months to land a new executive role. But nobody was hiring. The tech sector crashed and I was drowning. The severance ran out completely 4 months ago." My analytical brain kicked into high gear. As a forensic liquidator, I dissect financial ruins for a living. I follow the money. I find the hidden accounts, the shell companies, the buried liabilities. I looked at DeAndre's lifestyle. I mentally calculated the mortgage on a 6-bedroom estate, the property taxes, the maintenance, the luxury car leases, the private school tuitions. The math was violently incongruous. 4 months, I repeated slowly, letting the numbers align in my head. If the severance ran out 4 months ago, and you only had access to my Amex for groceries and gas, how did you pay the property taxes last quarter? How did you pay the tuition? How did you fund Madison's winter trip to Aspen? DeAndre froze. The remaining color drained from his face. His jaw trembled and he looked wildly up and down the empty hallway, terrified that someone might be listening. "I took out a loan." He choked out his voice, dropping so low I could barely hear him. "A personal loan." I pressed my eyes, narrowing. A second mortgage. He confessed the words tearing out of his throat. I took out a massive second mortgage on the house. $800,000. The hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air grew perfectly still. I stared at him, my mind rapidly processing the sheer unfathomable magnitude of his stupidity. I stepped away from the wall. I stood directly in front of him, forcing him to look at me. DeAndre, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. You took out a second mortgage on a house you do not legally own. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. I thought Barbara owned it. I thought Barbara controlled the trust. Madison told me the house was practically ours. I just needed the cash to keep everything afloat until I got a new job. That does not matter. I snapped, the severity of the situation sharpening my tone. Barbara's name is not on the deed. Madison's name is not on the deed. The property is legally owned by the Irrevocable Blind Trust. In order to secure an $800,000 mortgage against that asset, you had to provide the bank with proof of ownership. I watched his eyes dart away again. The pieces clicked together with devastating clarity. You forged the documents, I stated. It was not a question. You forged the title? You forged Barbara's signature. You likely fabricated a fraudulent deed of trust to present to a loan officer who was too lazy to double-check the county records. I had to, DeAndre whimpered, tears actually brimming in his eyes. We were going to lose everything. Madison was planning a massive charity gala at the house. If the bank foreclosed, the humiliation would have killed her. I forged the papers, Bethany. I took the money. I thought I could pay it back before anyone noticed. I let out a slow, deeply incredulous breath. The man was not just a pathetic liar. He was a spectacular, monumental criminal. Listen to me very carefully, I said, leaning in so close he could not escape my gaze. What you did is not a simple accounting error. It is not a white lie to save your marriage. You defrauded a federally insured banking institution for nearly $1 million using forged legal documents pertaining to an irrevocable trust. I raised my hand and ticked the charges off on my fingers. Federal bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, grand larceny. DeAndre, you are not facing bankruptcy, I told him, delivering the absolute truth with zero padding. You are facing federal prison. When the bank audits that loan, and they will audit that loan the second you miss a payment, the FBI will be knocking on the front door of my property to put you in handcuffs. He collapsed against the wall, sliding down until he was practically crouched on the floor. He grabbed the hem of my jacket, his hands shaking violently. Please, DeAndre begged, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. You control the trust. You have the money. You can pay off the mortgage. You can authorize the transfer retroactively. You can make it look like a legitimate distribution. Please, Bethany, I have children. I cannot go to prison. I will do anything you want. I will sign anything you want. Just cover the loan. Aye. I looked down at the man who had spent the last decade treating me like dirt on the bottom of his designer shoes. He was literally begging on his knees, asking me to commit a felony to cover up his federal crimes. Before I could even process the absolute audacity of his request, the heavy double doors of Mitchell's office slammed open. The sound cracked through the quiet hallway like a gunshot. DeAndre flinched, scrambling awkwardly to his feet. Barbara burst out of the office. She was not crying. She was not defeated. Her face was flushed with a terrifying, manic energy. Her eyes were wide and feral, practically glowing with renewed, vindictive triumph. In her right hand, she clutched a single piece of thick, watermarked paper. Madison trailed closely behind her, her own face mirroring our mother's vicious, resurrected arrogance. I knew it, Barbara screamed, her voice echoing down the corridor, completely ignoring the professional setting. I knew my father would never leave me entirely powerless. I knew he would never give a bitter, jealous little girl absolute control over this family. She marched directly toward me, waving the paper aggressively in the air. You thought you won, Barbara snarled, stopping inches from my face. You thought you could sit there and humiliate us. But Arthur is a meticulous man, Bethany. He keeps everything. He kept the original addendums. She thrust the paper forward, jabbing the corner of it into my chest. I found the loophole. Barbara declared, a twisted, victorious smile stretching across her face. I found the emergency dissolution clause. Barbara's heels clicked like rapid-fire gunfire as she marched down the Persian runner. She shoved past DeAndre, completely ignoring the fact that her son-in-law was currently slumped against the wall, hyperventilating and soaked in a cold sweat. Her eyes were locked entirely on me, burning with a frantic, triumphant greed. Madison was practically skipping behind her, a venomous smirk plastered across her perfectly contoured face. They had seemingly forgotten Arthur Mitchell entirely, focused solely on my impending destruction. Barbara did not stop until she was close enough for me to smell her expensive floral perfume. She slapped the thick piece of paper down onto the polished mahogany credenza beside me. The sharp smack echoed down the quiet corridor. "Read it and weep, you manipulative little snake," Barbara snarled. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the top of the page. "You honestly thought you were smarter than me. You thought you could just quietly steal my entire inheritance and rule over us. But my father was not a fool. He knew exactly what you were capable of." I slowly reached out and picked up the document. It was a single page printed on heavy bond paper. The heading, printed in bold block letters, read, "Durable Power of Attorney and Trust Override." "He signed it 3 months before he died," Barbara declared, crossing her arms over her chest, vibrating with self-satisfaction. "He realized he made a terrible mistake giving a bitter, jealous sociopath the keys to the kingdom. He drafted this to give me ultimate executive authority over the trust. If I deem the trustee unfit, or if I find evidence of gross mismanagement, I have the absolute legal right to override any financial decision, dissolve the trust, and revert the capital directly back into my control." Madison leaned in, her eyes glittering with malice. "And hiding the true nature of the estate from the rightful heirs is the literal definition of gross mismanagement. We are evicting you from the corporate accounts, Bethany. I am going to personally oversee the liquidation of your pathetic little forensic firm. You are going to be left with absolutely nothing." I ignored my sister's shrill gloating and focused on the paper in my hands. My professional training as a forensic auditor immediately took over. I did not read the emotional intent of the document. I read the data, the forensic discrepancies. The paper. My grandfather was a traditionalist. Every legal document he ever touched was printed on watermarked cotton fiber archival stock from a specific supplier he had used since the 1980s. This paper was standard commercial-grade heavyweight stock, the kind you could buy in bulk from any office supply store. The signature. The name was there, but the execution was entirely wrong. My grandfather had a sweeping, heavy-handed signature that pressed deeply into the paper. This signature was hesitant. The ink distribution was perfectly even, indicating a slow, careful trace, rather than a fluid, natural motion. The looping tail of the final letter lacked his signature sharp flick. The smoking gun. I shifted my gaze to the bottom right corner of the page. There, stamped in crisp blue ink, was the official seal of a notary public. I read the name inside the circular stamp. Kevin Laramie. A cold, razor-sharp realization settled over my mind. I knew exactly who Kevin Laramie was. I had audited a commercial real estate firm a year ago that had been heavily involved in escrow fraud. Kevin Laramie was the corrupt real estate attorney who had facilitated the fraudulent transfers. He was a former college fraternity brother of DeAndre Caldwell. And most importantly, Kevin Laramie had been officially disbarred and stripped of his notary license 18 months ago. My grandfather supposedly signed this document 3 months before his death. That meant Kevin Laramie's notary stamp had been invalid for over a year when this piece of paper was allegedly created. It was a forgery. It was a blatant, clumsy, unimaginably stupid forgery. I slowly lowered the document and looked over at DeAndre. He was still slumped against the wall, but he was no longer looking at the floor. He was staring at the piece of paper in my hand with an expression of absolute, unadulterated terror. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows listening to the lever being pulled. Barbara had not found a loophole. DeAndre had fabricated one. He was so desperate to hide his unemployment and maintain Madison's endless cash flow that he had taken out a fraudulent $800,000 second mortgage on a house he did not own. To do that, he needed forged ownership documents. He had clearly used his disgraced buddy Kevin Laramie to manufacture the fake deed for the bank. And while he was at it, he had Kevin draft this fake power of attorney to hand to Barbara, giving her a false sense of security and buying himself more time to siphon cash from the family accounts. DeAndre found it in a hidden file box in my father's old study. Barbara boasted unwittingly, confirming my entire theory. She shot DeAndre a look of profound gratitude. Thank God he had the sense to do a thorough sweep of the house before you could destroy the evidence. DeAndre squeezed his eyes shut. A single bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face. He knew exactly what I was holding. He knew that presenting a forged legal document to seize a $12 million estate elevated his crime from simple bank fraud to a massive coordinated federal conspiracy. The tactical choice. My mind raced through the possibilities. I could call the police right now. I could hand the forgery to Arthur Mitchell, have him verify it as a fake, and have Barbara and DeAndre escorted out of the building by security. They would face charges, certainly, but they would hire defense attorneys. They would claim ignorance. Barbara would throw DeAndre under the bus, claiming he tricked her. They would drag me through years of exhausting civil litigation, tying up the trust funds and muddying the waters with endless appeals. Or I could let them hang themselves. If Barbara officially submitted this forged power of attorney to a financial institution, if she used it to try and access the heavily monitored trust accounts, she would cross a permanent legal threshold. She would be committing federal wire fraud and bank fraud in real time. She would legally bind herself to DeAndre's criminal conspiracy. She would hand me the absolute undeniable power to destroy them both in a single devastating blow. I looked at the fake document. I looked at the sheer terror radiating from DeAndre. Then I looked up at my mother's triumphant, gloating face. She was vibrating with arrogance, fully believing she had just crushed me under her heel. I carefully folded the forged power of attorney in half. I reached out and gently tucked the document into the front pocket of my mother's designer blazer. I patted the fabric, smoothing it down with meticulous care. I offered her a soft, perfectly serene smile. "Okay, Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You win. Take the document." Mitchell bolted upright from behind his heavy mahogany desk, his chair screeching against the floorboards. The seasoned lawyer had spent 40 years identifying fraudulent paperwork, and it had taken him less than 3 seconds to spot the invalid notary stamp. "Bethany, do not do this," Mitchell warned, his voice sharp and urgent as he rounded the corner of the desk. "That document is completely—" I held up my hand, snapping my fingers together in a sharp, silencing gesture. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I kept my face perfectly smooth, masking the cold, calculating machinery turning rapidly in my mind. I shot Mitchell a look so intense, so loaded with absolute warning, that the elderly lawyer actually stopped in his tracks. He read my expression. He saw the trap yawning wide open, and he understood immediately that intervening now would ruin everything. Mitchell closed his mouth and slowly stepped back, crossing his arms and watching the impending disaster unfold. Barbara, of course, interpreted my gesture as a complete capitulation to her supreme authority. She let out a sharp, victorious bark of laughter. "That is the smartest thing you have done all morning," Barbara sneered carefully, folding the forged document and slipping it into her designer handbag as if it were the Holy Grail. "You finally realize you are entirely out of your depth. You thought you could waltz in here, play the corporate boss, and steal my father's legacy. But you are nothing. You have always been nothing. I am the head of this family, and I am taking back what is mine." Madison stepped up beside her, mirroring our mother's vicious triumph. "Pack up your little forensic auditing office." Bethany Madison mocked, her voice dripping with venom. "Mom is going to freeze every single one of your accounts by noon. You are going to be bankrupt before the weekend. Maybe you can get a job parking cars at my country club." I did not offer a defense. I did not flinch. I just maintained that same soft, pitying smile. DeAndre was the only one not celebrating. He looked physically ill, hovering near the office door like a ghost. He knew the document in Barbara's bag was a clumsy fake engineered by a disgraced, disbarred fraternity brother. He knew that presenting it to a bank was a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary, but he was too much of a coward to stop his mother-in-law, and he was too terrified of his wife to confess his own massive financial crimes. He was a passenger in a vehicle speeding toward a cliff, and he had just handed Barbara the steering wheel. "Let us go, Madison," Barbara commanded, adjusting her silk scarf. "We have a bank manager to visit. DeAndre, bring the car around. We have a lot of liquidating to do." They marched out of the office in a cloud of expensive perfume and unearned arrogance. The heavy double doors swung shut behind them, leaving Mitchell and me alone in the sudden ringing silence. Mitchell let out a long, heavy breath, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. "You know that notary stamp was Kevin Laramie," Mitchell said quietly. "The man lost his license 18 months ago for escrow fraud. That power of attorney is a blatant forgery. If she presents that to a federally insured institution, she is committing bank fraud." "I know," I replied, turning to walk toward the exit. "And because DeAndre used it to cover up a fraudulent second mortgage, they are engaging in a coordinated criminal conspiracy. If I had stopped them here, it would be a messy civil dispute. By letting them walk out with that paper, they are going to execute a federal crime on their own volition." Mitchell looked at me, a mixture of awe and slight terror in his eyes. "You are letting them hang themselves." "I am just giving them enough rope, Arthur." I left the law firm, the crisp city air feeling remarkably refreshing against my skin. I did not drive back to my suburban house. I drove straight to the sleek, high-security building that housed my forensic auditing firm. The contrast between the chaotic emotional warfare of my family and the cold, pristine logic of my office was exactly what I needed. I walked past my reception desk, greeted my senior analysts, and locked the door to my private corner office. I sat down at my desk, waking up the massive array of monitors mounted against the wall. As the sole legal trustee of my grandfather's irrevocable blind trust, I had absolute administrative access to the entire financial architecture of the estate. I logged into the encrypted banking portals, bypassing the standard commercial interfaces and accessing the high-level institutional dashboards. I knew exactly what Barbara and DeAndre were going to do. DeAndre was desperate for liquid cash to cover the tracks of his illegal $800,000 mortgage before the bank foreclosed on the mansion. Barbara, drunk on her delusion of reclaimed power, would march straight into the private wealth management branch downtown and demand an immediate massive transfer of funds to prove her dominance. They were going to use a forged document to try and crack a $12 million vault. I opened my forensic monitoring software. I linked the employer identification number of the family trust to a real-time FinCEN monitoring algorithm. I set up a digital tripwire. I placed custom high-priority alerts on every single account associated with the estate. Any unauthorized login attempt, any hard credit pull, and most importantly, any wire transfer request exceeding $10,000 would immediately trigger an alert directly to my server, bypassing the bank's standard processing delays. I finished coding the parameters, hit execute, and leaned back in my ergonomic chair. The screens hummed with quiet, steady lines of data. The trap was set. Now the hardest part was the waiting game. Day 1 passed in absolute silence. I drank my coffee, reviewed unrelated corporate audits, and watched the blinking green status indicator on my trust dashboard. Nothing. Barbara was likely strategizing, probably making an appointment with a senior branch manager to ensure she received the red carpet treatment when she executed her hostile takeover. Day 2 crawled by. The silence was thick and heavy. Madison had undoubtedly already started shopping on credit, assuming the floodgates of generational wealth were about to burst open. DeAndre was likely sweating through his tailored suits, praying the fake notary stamp held up to casual scrutiny. Then came day 3. It was a Friday morning precisely at 10:15, the busiest hour for private banking transactions before the weekend cutoff. I was in the middle of reviewing a tax discrepancy for a client when the speakers on my desk emitted a sharp, piercing three-tone chime. My primary monitor flashed brilliant, urgent red. I dropped my pen and rolled my chair directly in front of the screen. The tripwire had been triggered. The data flooded into my dashboard in real time, detailing an active in-progress transaction at the premier downtown branch of our primary financial institution. The alert detailed a hard authorization override attempt. Someone was physically standing in the bank presenting documentation to bypass the security protocols of the irrevocable blind trust. I clicked on the transaction details, my eyes scanning the raw data feed. The authorization document submitted was logged as a durable power of attorney. I checked the requested action. It was not a simple account inquiry, it was an outbound wire transfer request. Barbara was not just trying to take control, she was trying to drain the principal. I stared at the requested transfer amount, glowing in bright red digits on my screen. $2.5 million. They had actually done it. They had walked into a federal bank and presented a forged legal document to steal millions. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the direct line to the bank's senior fraud investigator. They had taken the bait. The glowing red digits on my primary monitor confirmed the catastrophic scale of their arrogance. I clicked on the transaction details, watching the digital breadcrumbs form a perfectly straight, undeniable line to federal prison. The initial $2.5 million wire transfer request had bounced against the strict security protocols I had hard-coded into the trust accounts. But Barbara had not given up. Driven by a desperate need to prove her dominance, she had pivoted. The new data stream cascading across my screen showed she had used the forged power of attorney to open a massive revolving line of credit. She secured it directly against the residential real estate portfolio of the irrevocable blind trust. She was leveraging the very same properties DeAndre had already illegally mortgaged. A localized wire transfer followed immediately after the credit line was approved. $150,000 had just left the account. I highlighted the routing number and ran a rapid trace. The destination account belonged to the Oakbrook Country Club. It was the most elite, obscenely expensive private establishment in the state, a place where initiation fees alone cost more than most people earned in a decade. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, piecing together the psychology behind the transaction with clinical precision. Madison had suffered a catastrophic public humiliation when my liquidation team repossessed her luxury SUV right out of her driveway. In her fiercely shallow social circle, perception was oxygen. She could not simply brush off the loss of a G-Wagon. She needed a dramatic, undeniable display of wealth to kill the rumors of her financial ruin before they took root among her wealthy friends. What better way to scream that she was completely untouchable than hosting a lavish, entirely spontaneous vow renewal? She and DeAndre had been married for 12 years, which was not a traditional milestone for a renewal, making the sheer extravagance of the event even more of a statement. She was going to throw a massive party to prove her bank accounts were bulletproof, and Barbara had actually done it. She had marched into the private wealth management branch, slammed Kevin Laramie's fraudulent backdated notary stamp on the manager's desk, and legally bound herself to DeAndre's criminal conspiracy. She authorized the six-figure deposit to secure the country club's grand ballroom, the imported floral arrangements, the top-tier catering, and whatever else Madison deemed absolutely necessary to save face. They were throwing a vanity party with stolen money, entirely oblivious to the fact that I was watching every single penny move across my forensic dashboard in real time. My hand hovered over the keyboard. I had the administrative power to block the transaction right then and there. I could freeze the line of credit, reverse the wire transfer, and lock Barbara out of the banking portal permanently. I did not touch the keyboard. If I froze the account now, Barbara could claim a banking error. She could play the victim, claiming she simply misunderstood the complex legal paperwork Arthur Mitchell had shown her. She could hire a defense attorney to argue that she was a confused, grieving daughter who made a clerical mistake. I needed the funds to clear. I needed the country club to process the payment and issue a binding receipt. I needed the crime to be fully, irreversibly executed across state lines using the federal banking system. I needed the paper trail to be absolute. I opened a secure, heavily encrypted master file on my server labeled Federal Evidence. I began systematically downloading the entire digital footprint of the morning's activities. I pulled the authorization forms Barbara had signed at the bank. I captured the digital scan of the forged power of attorney the teller had uploaded into the system. I exported the time-stamped wire confirmations and the associated IP addresses. I built an airtight, irrefutable portfolio of their grand larceny. As my forensic software finalized the data extraction, my personal phone buzzed on the desk. It was an automated notification from a social media monitoring tool I had set up weeks ago to track Madison and her family's public footprints. I tapped the alert, bringing up a newly uploaded video on TikTok. It was Kinsley. Madison's 16-year-old daughter was standing on a circular velvet pedestal inside a high-end exclusive bridal boutique. The camera panned up, showing Kinsley twirling slowly to show off a cascade of white silk tulle and hand-stitched Swarovski crystals. It was a custom designer gown easily worth $10,000, entirely inappropriate for a teenager attending her parents' vow renewal. In the mirrored background of the video, I could clearly see Madison sitting on a plush pink sofa. She was sipping from a crystal champagne flute and casually handing a sleek black credit card to a boutique attendant. It was the same credit line Barbara had just fraudulently opened. Kinsley stopped twirling and faced the camera directly. She tossed her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder, flashing a haughty, arrogant smile that was a carbon copy of her mother's. She raised her chin, looking down her nose at the lens with absolute unearned superiority. The caption hovering in bold, glittering pink letters across the center of the video read, "When the peasants try to ruin your life, but you always win." I stared at the screen, watching the teenager flaunt the fruits of a federal felony. She had no idea that the dress she was wearing was purchased with stolen funds. She had no idea that her father was an unemployed fraud, that her grandmother was a bank robber, or that her mother was eagerly orchestrating their collective downfall just to impress a room full of country club snobs. I tapped the screen, hit save, and dropped the video file directly into the evidence folder alongside the forged bank documents. The video file finished saving to my encrypted server with a quiet chime. I leaned forward, my fingers resting on the mechanical keyboard. The trap had not just been sprung. Madison had gleefully broadcast herself standing right in the center of it. Now it was time to close the jaws. I spent the next 72 hours completely immersed in the digital architecture of my family's self-destruction. I did not sleep. I ordered black coffee, locked my office door, and let the dual monitors illuminate the room. For a forensic auditor, this was not work. This was an autopsy. My family had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of the illusion. They bought luxury vehicles on predatory leases, wore designer labels funded by revolving credit debt, and smiled brightly for country club cameras while hiding past due notices in the bottom drawer of the kitchen island. They believed that if something looked legitimate on the surface, the world would simply accept it as fact. They failed to realize that I had spent my 20s working as a senior forensic auditor for a federal regulatory agency. I do not look at the surface. I look at the metadata. While they lazily relied on appearances, I operated in a world of absolute immutable data. I started with DeAndre. I accessed the county clerk's digital property portal and pulled the exact timestamp of the quitclaim deed he had filed to transfer the estate's residential portfolio into his fictitious holding company. It was an insultingly sloppy piece of fraud. DeAndre had used a cheap online legal template and completely failed to mask his digital footprint. I ran a reverse trace on the IP address logged by the county server. It pinned directly to the Wi-Fi router sitting in Madison's living room. He had literally stolen my grandfather's real estate while sitting on his own couch. From there, the $800,000 mortgage payout was a brightly lit runway. He had attempted to obscure the money by pinging it across 3 different regional banks, a textbook layer and integration laundering technique that might have confused a rookie bank teller. To my proprietary auditing software, it was a straight line. I tracked every single cent. $70,000 went to pay off the immediate repossession order on his remaining luxury vehicles. $40,000 was wired to Kinsley and her brother's private academy to clear a year of unpaid back tuition. The rest was aggressively bleeding out to cover property taxes and Madison's relentless retail therapy. Next, I turned my attention to the durable power of attorney Barbara had wielded at the bank. I pulled the digital scan of the document from the bank's encrypted server. The signature and stamp belonged to Kevin Laramie, a disgraced former attorney. I cross-referenced his name with the State Bar Association's disciplinary database. The results were beautifully damning. Kevin Laramie had been permanently disbarred and stripped of his notary commission on October 14th of last year. The forged power of attorney Barbara submitted was dated January 12th of this year. It was a temporal impossibility. Furthermore, the digital metadata embedded in the PDF scan proved the physical paper used was from a specific batch of legal stock manufactured 3 months after my grandfather had passed away. It was a completely airtight, objectively irrefutable federal felony. Finally, I isolated the 6-figure wire transfer that had just left the estate's newly compromised line of credit. I traced the routing number. The money had landed in a joint checking account controlled by Barbara for exactly 14 minutes before being wired out again. The destination was the primary merchant account for the Oakbrook Country Club. I pulled the itemized billing receipt generated by the club's financial software. Barbara and Madison were not just throwing a vow renewal, they were attempting to purchase a fortress of social invincibility. The invoice listed a full buyout of the Grand Ballroom, imported white orchids flown in from Holland, a premium open bar, and a deposit for a Michelin-starred catering team. They were spending $150,000 of stolen money to convince their shallow friends that they were financially untouchable. I hit the print command on my master terminal. For 20 minutes, the heavy-duty laser printer in the corner of my office roared to life, churning out page after page of undeniable evidence. Bank statements printed in stark black and white, highlighted routing logs, disbarment records, high-resolution screenshots of Kinsley flaunting stolen merchandise on social media. When the printer finally fell silent, I gathered the massive stack of paper. The sheer physical weight of their impending destruction was deeply satisfying. I retrieved 2 heavy crimson-red expanding file folders from my supply cabinet. I placed the first stack into the first red folder. This was my leverage. This was the exact weapon I needed to permanently excise these parasites from my life and secure my grandfather's legacy. I slid the second stack into the second red folder. This one was pre-labeled with the address of the regional field office of the FBI. If they chose to fight me, this folder went in the mail. I closed the flaps on both folders, tying the string closures with deliberate, methodical precision. The audit was complete. The trap was locked and loaded. Before I could stand up to stretch my aching muscles, the direct line on my desk phone began to ring. I glanced at the caller ID display. It was not a bank investigator. It was not my attorney. The screen read Oakbrook Country Club, Executive Office. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. Bethany Caldwell speaking. I answered, my voice perfectly smooth. Ms. Caldwell, thank God, a man's voice stammered on the other end. It was Richard Sterling, the general manager of Oakbrook. He sounded breathless, teetering on the absolute edge of a full-blown panic attack. I am so sorry to bother you on your direct line. I know you handle the corporate accounts for the estate, but we have a massive catastrophic problem regarding your mother's recent booking. Richard's silence on the other end of the line was heavy and palpable. I could practically hear his brain trying to reconcile the elegant high society image of my family with the cold, calculated federal sting operation I was currently orchestrating in his ballroom. A guest list, Richard finally managed to say, his voice strained. Ms. Caldwell, this is a private closed-door event. Your mother was extremely specific about security. She provided a laminated list. We are employing 3 separate checkpoints to ensure no uninvited guests gain entry. Madison is not paying for those security checkpoints, Richard, I interrupted smoothly. I am. And as the sole financier of this evening, I am amending the guest list. I pulled up a separate encrypted document on my monitor. I had been compiling this specific list for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy it. Grab a pen, I instructed. I heard the frantic shuffling of paper on his desk. Ready. Guest number 1, Arthur Mitchell. He is the senior managing partner at Mitchell, Hayes & Sterling. He is also the legal executor of the estate your mother just attempted to defraud. Seat him at table 1 directly next to the bridal party. Understood, Richard said, his voice tight. Guest number 2, Special Agent Marcus Vance. He is the lead investigator for the FBI's regional white-collar crime division. I spent 4 years working directly under him. He will be arriving with 2 associates. They do not need to be announced, but they require a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the main stage. A sharp intake of breath hissed through the receiver. The FBI, Ms. Caldwell, if there is a federal raid at Oak Brook, the board of directors will have my head. We value discretion above all else. Discretion is exactly what I am paying for, I replied. Agent Vance is not coming to kick the doors down. He is coming to observe. He already has the digital evidence. Tonight he needs the physical confirmation. He needs to see Madison and DeAndre accepting the stolen goods, and he needs to see Barbara physically present as the orchestrator. I leaned into the microphone, my tone dropping to an absolute chilling calm. Here is my ultimatum, Richard. You have 2 choices. Choice 1, you follow my instructions to the letter. You smile at my mother, you pour the Dom Perignon, and you treat them like absolute royalty. You do not breathe a single word about the declined credit line, the reversed wire, or my involvement. If you do this, I will not only cover the $150,000, but I will authorize a 20% gratuity for your entire staff for their trouble. I paused, letting the financial incentive settle in his mind. Choice 2. You tip them off. You try to play the middleman. If you do that, I will instantly reverse my wire transfer. I will leave you holding a 6-figure deficit. Then I will personally ensure that Agent Vance executes a highly publicized, incredibly disruptive raid on your country club during your busy Sunday brunch rush. I will make sure the local news vans are parked on your immaculate 18th green. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Richard was a pragmatist. He knew when he was outmatched. Table 1 will be reserved for your guests, Ms. Caldwell, Richard said quietly. The staff will be completely discreet. The event will proceed flawlessly. Excellent, I said. I will see you tomorrow evening. The next 24 hours moved with the relentless mechanical precision of a ticking clock. I did not spend the day pacing or anxious. I spent it finalizing the digital archive. Every forged signature, every fraudulent IP address, and every unauthorized wire transfer was cataloged, encrypted, and backed up across 3 separate offshore servers. When the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the city, I finally stepped away from my monitors to prepare. I was not dressing for a vow renewal. I was dressing for an execution. I chose a tailored charcoal gray designer suit, sharp, severe, and entirely unapproachable. It was the armor of a forensic auditor, a stark contrast to the pastel-ruffled extravagance Madison undoubtedly demanded of her guests. I picked up the 2 crimson-red folders from my desk. The first, containing the immediate leverage, went into my sleek leather briefcase. The second, destined for the federal prosecutor's office, was already sealed in a priority overnight envelope. I dropped it in the outbound mail slot on my way out the door. The gears were officially in motion. There was no turning back. I arrived at the Oak Brook Country Club exactly 45 minutes after the event officially began. The valet rushed to open my door, his eyes briefly widening at the sight of my suit amidst a sea of sequins and tuxedos. I stepped into the grand foyer. The sheer scale of Madison's vanity was staggering. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, their heavy, sweet scent masking the underlying rot of the occasion. Crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead, illuminating a massive, custom-built ice sculpture anchoring the center of the room. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. It was a masterpiece of illusion, and it was all paid for with stolen money. Richard Sterling materialized from the crowd almost instantly. His face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat visible on his forehead, despite the aggressive air conditioning. "Ms. Caldwell," he murmured, keeping his voice incredibly low. "Everything is set." "My guess?" I asked. "Seated at table 1 exactly as requested," he confirmed, gesturing discreetly toward the front of the room. "Your mother and sister are in the bridal suite preparing for the grand entrance. They suspect absolutely nothing." I nodded, my eyes scanning the room. The local high society elite were all here: bankers, real estate developers, and socialites, all sipping stolen champagne, completely unaware that they were extras in a federal sting operation. "Thank you, Richard." I said, my gaze locking onto the VIP table at the front. "You may begin the service." I walked slowly through the crowd, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet. At table 1, Arthur Mitchell sat looking profoundly uncomfortable, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Next to him, Special Agent Vance offered me a brief, nearly imperceptible nod. I took the empty seat beside them, placing my leather briefcase gently on the table. The lights in the grand ballroom began to dim, and a single brilliant spotlight snapped onto the main stage. The show was about to begin. I disconnected the line with Richard, setting the receiver down with a sharp click. Table 1 was reserved, but a VIP table required a full roster of highly motivated spectators. Agent Vance and Arthur Mitchell were a solid foundation, but the true dismantling of my family's empire required the presence of the very people they were trying to impress and defraud. I pulled up my encrypted dossier and selected the next target. I dialed the direct line of Marcus Thorne, the senior executive vice president at the bank that held the mortgage on the estate. He was the man who had personally signed off on DeAndre's fraudulent $800,000 cash-out refinance. Marcus Thorne. His voice boomed through the speaker, carrying the arrogant weight of a man who believed his ledger was untouchable. "Mr. Thorne, this is Bethany Caldwell. I am the legal executor and primary auditor for the Caldwell Irrevocable Blind Trust. We need to discuss the quitclaim deed you approved for my brother-in-law, DeAndre Caldwell, last month. Ms. Caldwell, I assure you, our legal department reviews every document with the utmost scrutiny," he replied, his tone instantly shifting into corporate defense mode. Everything was perfectly in order. It was a forged deed filed from a residential IP address, using a template downloaded from a public legal forum. I stated, my voice devoid of any emotion. Your underwriter failed to verify the chain of title, and your compliance division approved a multi-$100,000 payout to a shell company with zero operational history. I have the metadata, the routing numbers, and the undeniable proof that your branch facilitated a massive real estate fraud. The line grew deathly quiet. I could practically hear the blood draining from his face. "I am hosting an event tomorrow evening at the Oakbrook Country Club." I continued, offering him a lifeline wrapped in barbed wire. "I have a physical copy of the audit with your branch's name all over it. If you want a chance to review the evidence and save your career before I hand it over to federal regulators, you will be at table 1 by 7 o'clock sharp. Wear a plain suit. Do not draw attention to yourself." "I will be there," he choked out, the arrogance entirely stripped from his voice. I ended the call and immediately dialed the next number on my list. Kinsley had spent the last week treating service workers like dirt and flaunting her stolen designer gowns online. Her entire shallow identity rested on her pending early admission to Prescott University, a fiercely competitive Ivy League institution that rigorously vetted the moral and financial standing of its applicants. "Prescott Admissions Dean Hawthorne's office," a polite assistant answered. I bypassed the assistant with a firm demand, citing an urgent legal matter regarding an incoming freshman's financial aid and tuition status. Within 2 minutes, Dean Hawthorne was on the line, sounding deeply annoyed by the interruption. "Dean Hawthorne, my name is Bethany Caldwell," I said smoothly. "I am auditing the financial records of one of your early admission candidates, Kinsley Caldwell. Her parents have submitted financial disclosures claiming substantial wealth and offering a massive endowment donation to secure her acceptance." "We do not discuss applicant financials with unauthorized third parties," the dean interrupted sharply. "You will discuss this one," I countered. "The endowment money they promised you does not exist. The tuition checks they plan to write are funded entirely by a fraudulent multi-million-dollar line of credit stolen from a federal trust. I have the bank routing logs and time-stamped video evidence of the applicant spending the stolen funds. If you process her acceptance, your prestigious university will be publicly named as a recipient of laundered money in a federal indictment." I let the weight of the scandal settle over the line. Prescott University survived on its immaculate reputation. A money laundering scandal involving stolen trust funds would be a public relations catastrophe. "Where is this evidence?" the dean asked, his annoyance instantly replaced by acute self-preserving panic. "Oakbrook Country Club tomorrow evening at 7, I instructed. "Table 1, dress discreetly. You will receive the physical dossier there." I hung up and moved to the final call. The FBI handled the federal wire fraud, but the state-level crimes, the forged notary, stamp the identity theft, the filing of false public records, required local jurisdiction. I dialed the direct cell phone of Chief Robert Miller, the head of the city's white-collar crime division. "Miller," he answered gruffly. "Chief, it is Bethany Caldwell. I have a finalized forensic audit for you. 2 perpetrators, multiple state felonies, including uttering a forged instrument, identity theft, and real estate fraud. The notary stamp used belongs to Kevin Laramie." "Laramie was disbarred last year," Miller said, his tone instantly sharpening with professional interest. "Are you telling me someone is still using his seal?" "I have the physical documents proving they used his seal 3 months after his disbarment to illegally extract a line of credit," I confirmed. "The perpetrators are hosting a massive lavish party tomorrow night using the stolen funds. Special Agent Vance from the Federal Bureau will be there to observe the wire fraud. I need you there to handle the state-level arrests." "Send me the address," Miller said, the grim satisfaction evident in his voice. "I will be there in plain clothes." I placed the receiver down for the final time. The VIP table was fully booked. The audience was assembled. The financial executive, the academic gatekeeper, the federal agent, and the local police chief. They were all coming to watch my family burn. 24 hours later, I pulled my car up to the grand entrance of the Oak Brook Country Club. The valet opened my door and I stepped out into the cool evening air, my briefcase gripped firmly in my right hand. I walked through the towering glass doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. The sheer blinding opulence of the room was nauseating. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceiling like a floral waterfall. A massive ice sculpture of 2 intertwined swans slowly melted in the center of the room, surrounded by platters of beluga caviar and endless rows of vintage champagne flutes. Women in glittering diamond necklaces and men in tailored tuxedos laughed loudly, clinking their glasses together in a grotesque display of unearned wealth. At the very center of the room, standing on a raised platform, beneath a crystal chandelier, were Madison and DeAndre. Madison wore a custom silk gown that dragged across the floor, holding a microphone and basking in the adoration of her wealthy, clueless friends. DeAndre stood beside her, flashing a brilliant, arrogant smile, looking completely invincible. They were holding court, entirely oblivious to the reality that their kingdom was built on sand. I stood in the shadows near the entrance, my eyes scanning the front of the room. There it was. Table 1. I watched as Dean Hawthorne took his seat, his face pale and rigid. Next to him sat Marcus Thorne, looking like a man marching to the gallows. Chief Miller and Agent Vance sat quietly on the end, sipping sparkling water, their eyes locked onto the stage. The trap was primed. The audience was waiting. I tightened my grip on the briefcase and stepped into the light. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the 200 guests, but the light did nothing to soften the sharp, tailored lines of my charcoal gray suit. I tightened my grip on the briefcase and stepped into the light. I moved out from the shadows of the arched entryway, my presence initially masked by the sheer volume of the crowd and the overwhelming heavy scent of imported orchids. Up on the raised platform, Madison tapped her microphone. A brief, high-pitched ring echoed through the speakers, signaling the room to quiet down for the guests of honor. She was a blinding, absurd spectacle. Her custom silk gown was heavily encrusted with thousands of hand-sewn Swarovski crystals, catching the chandelier light and fracturing it across the walls like a rotating disco ball. DeAndre stood half a step behind her, wearing a pristine velvet tuxedo jacket projecting the manufactured, unbothered aura of a self-made mogul. "Thank you all for coming," Madison cooed into the microphone, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "DeAndre and I wanted to renew our vows tonight because this past year has been an absolute testament to our resilience. When you reach a certain level of success, you learn very quickly who your true friends are." She paused, placing a manicured hand over her heart, playing to the crowd of bankers, real estate developers, and local socialites. "You also learn that some people simply cannot handle watching others thrive." Madison continued, adopting a tone of profound manufactured tragedy. We have had to make the incredibly painful decision to cut out deeply toxic, jealous family members. People who wanted nothing more than to drag us down to their miserable level. But looking out at all of your beautiful faces tonight, I know we made the right choice. We are surrounded by winners. The crowd murmured in sympathetic agreement. Somewhere near the front, Barbara wiped a performative tear from her eye, playing the role of the heartbroken but supportive matriarch to absolute perfection. I stepped fully onto the polished hardwood of the main dance floor. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. I simply walked. The rhythmic sharp strike of my leather heels cut through the ambient noise of the room. One by one, heads began to turn. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased. The wealthy elite of Oakbrook parted like the Red Sea, stepping back to clear a direct, unobstructed path between the heavy oak entrance doors and the main stage. As I walked down the center aisle, I passed table 1. Dean Hawthorne sat rigidly in his chair, his eyes locked onto Kinsley, who was currently taking selfies near the ice sculpture. The color had completely drained from his face. He looked like a man watching his prestigious university's reputation evaporate in real time. Marcus Thorne, the banking executive who had recklessly approved the fraudulent mortgage, was gripping his water glass so tightly his knuckles were white. He was staring directly at DeAndre, the reality of his catastrophic underwriting failure settling over him like a suffocating weight. Chief Miller and Special Agent Vance sat perfectly still. They did not look at me. They operated with the cold, predatory patience of men who had cornered their targets and were simply waiting for the final signal to strike. The ambient chatter in the ballroom died, completely replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. 200 guests held their breath, their eyes darting nervously between my severe clinical presence and the sparkling bride on the stage. Madison's voice faltered. The microphone picked up her sharp, panicked intake of breath. The indulgent, victorious smile slid off her face, replaced by a mask of absolute horror as she stared down at me. DeAndre shifted uncomfortably, the arrogant posture evaporating as his eyes darted toward the side exits, his survival instincts finally realizing that the walls were closing in. I stopped directly in front of the raised platform, standing right beside the DJ's massive soundboard. I placed my heavy leather briefcase onto the edge of the table with a dull, authoritative thud. "What is the meaning of this?" Barbara's voice hissed through the dead silence. She emerged from the frozen crowd, marching toward me with a furious, rapid stride. She was wearing an overly elaborate, ruffled emerald gown that aggressively clashed with the elegant decor. 2 of Oakbrook's private security guards trailed hesitantly behind her, looking entirely unsure of how to handle a woman in a designer business suit who had walked into the room with the commanding authority of an owner. "You were explicitly barred from this property, Bethany," Barbara spat, stopping mere inches from me. She kept her voice low, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of high society decorum, while her eyes burned with absolute unadulterated venom. "You could not stand to see your sister happy, could you? You had to come here and ruin her night out of pure pathetic spite." I looked down at her, my expression perfectly blank and emotionally vacant. "I am not here to ruin anything, Barbara," I replied evenly. "I am here to facilitate the final accounting." "You are delusional," she sneered. She turned sharply to the 2 security guards standing awkwardly behind her. "Take her by the arms and throw her out the service doors. If she resists, call the police and have her arrested for criminal trespassing." The guards shifted their weight. They glanced nervously toward the back of the room, where Richard Sterling, the general manager, stood plastered against the wall, sweating profusely. Richard gave a frantic, nearly imperceptible shake of his head. The guards did not move an inch. "I said, remove her," Barbara demanded, her voice rising in pitch, the facade of control rapidly fracturing in front of her high society peers. "Do your jobs!" I calmly reached over the DJ's soundboard and grabbed the secondary microphone. I flicked the switch, the small green light clicking on, and raised my hand. I tapped the metal mesh grill twice. The sharp percussive thumps echoed like gunshots through the cavernous, silent ballroom. The 200 guests flinched. Up on the stage, Madison's hands shook so violently she dropped her own microphone, letting it fall against her diamond-encrusted dress with a heavy thud. I looked directly into my mother's furious, panicked eyes. My voice amplified, and crystal clear, echoing off the vaulted ceilings for every single person in the room to hear. "I wouldn't do that, Mom. I brought the actual owners of this party." The echo of my voice ringing through the ballroom sound system acted like a physical blow to the crowd. The 200 affluent guests stood absolutely paralyzed. Nobody whispered. Nobody reached for a champagne flute. The only sound in the cavernous orchid-draped space was the steady hum of the climate control system and the faint rhythmic dripping of the melting ice sculpture in the center of the room. Barbara stood frozen just inches from me, her mouth slightly open, the emerald ruffles of her gown trembling with her sudden sharp breaths. The two private security guards took one look at my unwavering posture, glanced at the very serious men in plain clothes sitting at table 1, and took 3 simultaneous steps backward, completely removing themselves from the equation. I did not spare my mother another glance. She was merely the facilitator. The true parasites were up on the stage. I bypassed Barbara entirely, walking with slow, deliberate steps toward the edge of the raised platform. My eyes locked onto my niece. Kinsley was standing near the edge of the stage, clutching her latest iPhone. She was wearing a custom silk chiffon dress that easily cost $5,000, her wrists dripping in diamond tennis bracelets purchased with stolen equity. Just moments ago, she had been broadcasting her extravagant wealth to her thousands of social media followers. Now she looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a rapidly approaching freight train. "You called me cheap, Kinsley," I said into the microphone, my voice a smooth, icy current cutting through the silence. "You told me that I did not understand the lifestyle you were destined for, so let us talk about value." I reached into my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp, heavy stock white envelope. It bore the unmistakable prestigious gold foil crest of Prescott University. I held it out toward her. Kinsley did not move. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of petulant confusion. "I do not know what you are doing, Aunt Bethany, but you are completely embarrassing yourself," she sneered, attempting to project her usual manufactured superiority. "You are ruining my mother's party." "I am adjusting the accounting," I corrected smoothly. "Take the envelope, Kinsley." When she hesitated, I stepped up onto the first stair of the platform and pressed the envelope directly against her chest. Instinctively, her manicured hands came up to grasp it. "Before you open that," I instructed, turning slightly to gesture toward the front row, "I want you to acknowledge the gentleman sitting at table 1, the man in the gray suit looking directly at you." Kinsley's eyes followed my gesture. Dean Hawthorne sat rigidly in his chair. He did not offer her a warm, welcoming smile. He looked at her with the severe, unforgiving expression of an academic gatekeeper who had just discovered a rat in his pristine admissions pool. Kinsley gasped, recognizing him instantly from her campus tours and final interview rounds. "Dean Hawthorne," she stammered, her voice dropping its arrogant edge. What is he doing here?" "He is here to personally oversee the revocation of your admission," I stated, raising the microphone again so the entire ballroom could hear the absolute dismantling of her fake reality. "You see, Kinsley Prescott University expects its students to possess both academic excellence and unimpeachable moral character. Yesterday morning, an automated payment of $75,000 was initiated to cover your freshman year tuition housing and your heavily exaggerated endowment pledge." I stepped closer to her, invading her space, forcing her to look me in the eye. "You attempted to run that charge on the primary black card linked to the Caldwell Irrevocable Blind Trust, a card that I, as the legal executor, permanently canceled 72 hours ago." "That is a lie," Kinsley shouted, her voice shrill and panicked. "My dad paid that. He wired the money." "Your father attempted to wire the money from a secondary line of credit," I countered, my tone completely merciless. "A line of credit he illegally opened using a forged power of attorney and a disbarred notary stamp. That wire was intercepted by the Federal Fraud Division at exactly 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon." I turned to face the audience, addressing her wealthy, appearance-obsessed friends who were gathered near the front of the stage. "Prescott University does not accept laundered money. They do not grant early admission to applicants funded by federal wire fraud. I provided Dean Hawthorne with the complete time-stamped digital audit of your family's transactions. I turned back to my niece. Open the envelope, Kinsley. With shaking, uncoordinated fingers, Kinsley tore the gold-embossed seal. She pulled out the heavy cream-colored letter. Her eyes darted rapidly across the few typed paragraphs. The physical reaction was immediate. All the color drained from her face. Her knees buckled slightly, and she let out a visceral, high-pitched shriek of absolute horror. It was an expulsion notice. Her future, her status, her entire carefully curated identity had been vaporized in a matter of seconds. The social consequences were instantaneous. The group of elite private school teenagers she had spent the entire evening trying to impress did not rush forward to comfort her. Instead, a sea of glowing screens illuminated the front row. Her friends had their phones out, hitting record, capturing every agonizing second of her humiliation. In their world, weakness was blood in the water, and Kinsley was bleeding out on the main stage. "Mom!" Kinsley screamed, her voice cracking as she crumpled the letter in her fists. "Mom, fix this. Tell her she is lying. Do something." The spotlight caught the blinding flash of Swarovski crystals as Madison lunged forward. Her face was contorted with a rage so profound it shattered her elegant high society facade completely. She looked feral. DeAndre stepped up right beside her, squaring his shoulders and puffing out his chest, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into backing down. They were standing exactly where I wanted them. I dropped the crumpled envelope onto the floor at Kinsley's feet. I turned my back on my sobbing niece and slowly pivoted my deadly clinical focus entirely onto the bride and groom. I stepped away from the soundboard and walked deliberately toward the massive 5-tier wedding cake positioned just to the right of the stage. It was a ridiculous monstrosity covered in white fondant and edible gold leaf, a perfect physical representation of my sister's manufactured life. I snapped open the gold clasps of my briefcase, withdrew a thick red folder, and dropped it flat onto the cake table. The heavy smack of cardboard hitting the polished wood echoed loudly, snapping the room out of its collective shock. I looked directly at Madison. Her face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, torn between the urge to run to her screaming daughter and the desperate need to maintain her high society posture. "You stand up there dripping in diamonds, bragging about your resilience and your elite circle," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "You claim you are celebrating a wealthy, successful marriage tonight. Tell me, Madison, what exactly are you celebrating? Because your husband has been unemployed for 8 months. A collective gasp rippled through the 200 guests. In Oak Brook, financial failure was a cardinal sin, but lying about it was a social death sentence. Madison let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, gripping the tulle of her skirt. "You are completely insane, Bethany. DeAndre is a senior vice president of acquisitions. Everyone in this room knows that." DeAndre was a senior vice president, I corrected smoothly, my gaze flicking to the man standing rigidly beside her. "Until he was quietly terminated last October for gross negligence and expense account abuse. He has spent the past 8 months putting on a tailored velvet tuxedo or a designer suit every single morning, driving away in a leased Porsche and sitting in a high-end coffee shop downtown, playing on his laptop. He did all of this while your lifestyle continued to drain your accounts dry and your debts piled up to the ceiling." DeAndre's jaw clenched. The arrogant, invincible aura he had projected all evening vanished instantly, replaced by a sheen of cold sweat across his forehead. He took a half step forward, raising a hand as if to stop me, but the sheer weight of the crowd's judging eyes kept him glued to the stage. "Do not listen to her, Maddie," DeAndre said, his voice tight and unnaturally strained. "She is just making things up to cause a scene. She is bitter. To keep you in those designer gowns and to fund this ridiculous vow renewal, he needed cash." I continued, completely ignoring his weak attempt at a defense. "So he took out an $800,000 cash-out refinance on your estate. But since he had absolutely zero income and a rapidly deteriorating credit score, he could not qualify legally. He used a forged quitclaim deed and a stolen federal trust account to secure the loan." I turned my back to the stage and faced the crowd. I raised my hand and pointed directly at table 1. Mr. Thorne, I said, my tone shifting into a sharp, commanding directive. Please stand up. Marcus Thorne stood up from his chair. The senior executive vice president looked like a man marching to his own execution. His face was the color of ash, and his tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big. The murmurs in the crowd intensified. Many of the guests recognized Thorne. He was a staple at their country club dinners and charity galas. Seeing him standing there looking utterly defeated and terrified validated every single word I had just spoken. Mr. Thorne, you personally underwrote and approved the loan for DeAndre Caldwell, I stated. Please clarify the current status of that transaction for the guests. Thorne swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward Special Agent Vance, who was watching him with the predatory patience of a hawk. The loan was secured through highly fraudulent documents. Thorne announced, his voice carrying a slight tremor that the microphone easily picked up. Our compliance division failed to verify the chain of title. The bank has officially voided the transaction and frozen all associated accounts to mitigate federal penalties. He sat back down abruptly, burying his face in his hands. Madison stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked back at DeAndre, then down at me. What does that mean? She demanded, her voice shrill and trembling with rising panic. What is he talking about? It means you do not own your house anymore, Madison, I said, delivering the fatal blow with clinical precision. The bank initiated an emergency seizure of assets to recoup the stolen funds. They officially foreclosed on the property at exactly 5 o'clock this evening. The locks have been changed. The security codes have been wiped. While you were sitting in the bridal suite sipping vintage champagne and getting your makeup done, the bank was literally putting your custom designer furniture on the curb. The silence in the ballroom shattered completely. The elite guests of Oakbrook descended into a frenzy of frantic whispers and muffled exclamations. Dozens of smartphones were immediately raised high into the air, their camera lenses focused directly on the stage. The people Madison had spent years trying to impress were now eagerly documenting her spectacular downfall. Madison stood completely paralyzed. The words seemed to physically strike her. She turned slowly to look at DeAndre. Tell me she is lying, Madison whispered, her voice cracking. DeAndre, tell me we still have the house. DeAndre could not look her in the eye. He stared down at his polished Italian leather shoes, his silence a deafening confession. Madison let out a visceral, blood-curdling shriek. The sound tore through the ballroom, raw and agonizing. She lunged forward, her hand swinging in a wide, vicious arc. The sound of her palm connecting with DeAndre's face cracked like a whip over the speakers. His head snapped to the side, a bright red mark instantly blooming across his cheek. You liar! Madison screamed, hitting him again, completely abandoning her refined facade. You ruined me! You lost my house! DeAndre grabbed her wrists, struggling to hold her back as she thrashed against him, her diamond-encrusted gown tearing at the seams. Kinsley was still on the floor nearby, sobbing hysterically over her expulsion letter. The picture-perfect family was physically tearing itself apart on a raised, illuminated stage for all of their high society friends to broadcast to the world. Suddenly, a heavy hand slammed down onto the cake table right next to my red folder. I turned to see Barbara. Her face was flushed a deep, dangerous purple, the veins in her neck bulging against her diamond choker. She had pushed past the frozen security guards, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate rage. This means absolutely nothing! Barbara screamed, pointing a trembling finger in my face. Do you hear me, Bethany? Nothing. I am the matriarch of this family. I hold the ultimate legally binding power of attorney over the Caldwell Irrevocable Blind Trust. I sign the checks. I control the assets. You have no authority to cancel any cards or seize any property without my explicit notarized consent. I had my lawyer draft this power of attorney months ago. Barbara continued, her voice reaching a shrill, hysterical pitch. She unclasped her oversized jewel-encrusted clutch and ripped out a thick folded stack of legal paper. She waved it wildly in the air, the stiff pages crinkling loudly in the microphone's feedback. I carry it with me to show the wealth management team exactly who is in charge. Barbara boasted, her chest heaving with arrogant pride. It has my signature. It has a certified notary stamp. It gives me unrestricted, unchallengeable access to the Caldwell accounts. That includes the $150,000 line of credit I initiated last week to fund this beautiful vow renewal and Kinsley's remaining tuition. Barbara marched right up to the edge of the stage, leaning down to thrust the papers directly into my face. I am immune to your little accounting tricks, Bethany. She spat, her eyes wide and manic. And since you are currently trespassing on a private event funded entirely by my legally secured credit line, I am going to have the authorities drag you out of here in handcuffs. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the papers shaking in her clenched fist, and then I looked up into her furious, flushed face. A slow, chilling smile spread across my lips. Mom, I said, my voice projecting through the speakers with a deadly calm resonance. You just admitted in front of 200 witnesses and the chief of police that you used a forged document to secure a $150,000 line of credit. Barbara scoffed, her emerald ruffles shaking as she pulled the papers back to her chest. It is not forged, you ignorant child. It is perfectly legal. It was notarized by Kevin Laramie. He has been our family attorney for a decade. Kevin Laramie was officially disbarred by the state Supreme Court 14 months ago. I stated, my tone dropping to a clinical, devastating register. He lost his license to practice law, and his notary commission was permanently revoked after he was caught embezzling from elderly clients. A notary stamp from a disbarred attorney renders any legal document entirely fraudulent. The color drained from Barbara's face so fast she looked physically ill. Her mouth hung open, but no words came out. The heavy stack of papers in her hand suddenly trembled uncontrollably. Taking money from a federally protected blind trust, using a fraudulent document across state lines, is not a family dispute, Mom. I continued, twisting the metaphorical knife. It constitutes federal wire fraud. It is a Class C felony. And since you just stood on a stage with a microphone and confessed to initiating the transaction yourself, you saved the prosecutors a tremendous amount of paperwork. You cannot prove any of this. Barbara choked out, her voice barely a whisper, the arrogant matriarch persona completely disintegrating. I do not have to prove it, I replied, turning my gaze away from my mother and gesturing directly toward the front row. They do. At table 1, Chief Miller and Special Agent Vance stood up in perfect unison. The scraping of their chairs against the hardwood floor sounded like a death knell. Chief Miller reached into the breast pocket of his plain dark suit and pulled out a silver badge, holding it up high for the entire ballroom to see. The collective gasp from the high society crowd was deafening. The realization swept through the room like a shockwave. The men sitting quietly at the VIP table were not banking executives or distant relatives. They were law enforcement. Barbara Caldwell and DeAndre Caldwell. Chief Miller's deep authoritative voice boomed, cutting through the rising panic of the guests. You are both under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and uttering a forged instrument. DeAndre's eyes widened in sheer animalistic panic. He spun around, frantically scanning the stage for an exit. He took 2 rapid steps toward the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the platform, his survival instincts screaming at him to run. He did not make it to a 3rd step. 3 plainclothes police officers, who had spent the entire evening blending in flawlessly with the catering staff near the kitchen doors, sprinted forward. They vaulted onto the stage with practiced, terrifying efficiency. One officer tackled DeAndre around the waist, driving him hard onto the polished wood floor. The pristine velvet tuxedo jacket tore at the shoulder as DeAndre hit the ground with a heavy, breathless grunt. Put your hands behind your back, the officer commanded, pressing a knee firmly between DeAndre's shoulder blades. DeAndre thrashed wildly, his manicured nails scratching against the floorboards, but the officers easily overpowered him. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed through the room, a sound so final and devastating it made the crowd shrink back in terror. Down on the main floor, another officer approached Barbara. She stumbled backward, her emerald gown catching on her heels. "Do not touch me!" Barbara shrieked, batting her hands wildly at the officer. "I am a Caldwell. You cannot do this to me. Bethany, tell them to stop." I stood perfectly still, watching my mother's reign of terror officially end. "You are under arrest, Mom. I highly suggest you stop resisting." The officer firmly grabbed Barbara's wrists, twisting them behind her back. She let out a loud, undignified wail as the second pair of handcuffs clicked shut, locking the matriarch of the family in cold steel. The legal papers she had been waving so triumphantly fell to the floor, trampled beneath the officer's boots. Up on the stage, Madison collapsed to her knees, her diamond-encrusted silk gown pooled around her like broken glass. She buried her face in her hands, releasing a series of hysterical, breathless screams as the officers hauled her newly arrested husband to his feet. Kinsley sat frozen in the corner, clutching her expulsion letter, her mascara running down her face in thick, dark streaks, staring blankly at her handcuffed grandmother. Outside the towering glass doors of the Oakbrook Country Club, the night sky suddenly erupted in flashing red and blue lights. The wail of police sirens pierced the air, growing louder and more urgent as multiple patrol cars swarmed the grand entrance. The glittering vow renewal had devolved into absolute, unprecedented chaos. Wealthy guests scrambled over each other, desperately trying to get out of the way of the arresting officers. Champagne flutes shattered against the floor. The string quartet had long since stopped playing, replaced by the sounds of sirens, sobbing women, and the harsh, unyielding commands of law enforcement. I stepped back, picking up my leather briefcase from the DJ's table. I watched calmly as the officers marched my mother and my brother-in-law through the center of the ballroom, parading them in handcuffs, past the very people they had tried so desperately to impress. The empire was gone, the debts were called in, and the true cost of their vanity was finally being paid. The metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the ballroom. "You have the right to remain silent." The arresting officer's voice cut through the ambient panic with absolute uncompromising authority. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Barbara thrashed against the officer's grip. The emerald ruffles of her gown shuddered wildly. She turned her frantic gaze toward the crowd, searching the sea of wealthy socialites, country club board members, and elite philanthropists for a savior. She found none. The very people she had spent her entire life trying to impress were now actively participating in her public execution, their smartphone cameras recording every humiliating second of her downfall. "I am a Caldwell!" Barbara shrieked, the panic finally shattering her aristocratic facade. "You cannot do this. I have money. I have influence." "You have a federal indictment, ma'am," Chief Miller replied flatly, gesturing for the officers to move her toward the exit. "Keep walking." Beside her, DeAndre offered no resistance. He was hauled to his feet, his pristine velvet tuxedo jacket ripped at the shoulder seam, his arrogant posture completely deflated. He kept his eyes glued to the polished hardwood floor, refusing to look at the crowd, refusing to look at his wife, and explicitly refusing to look at me. The reality of federal prison had already settled over him. As the officers began to march them toward the grand entrance, a sudden desperate movement caught my eye. Madison collapsed completely. Her legs gave out, and she hit the floor hard. The heavy silk and thousands of hand-sewn Swarovski crystals that made up her custom gown dragged her down like a sparkling anchor. She ignored the shattered champagne flutes scattered across the dance floor. She ignored the gasps of her friends. She crawled toward me, her manicured hands grasping at the hem of my tailored trousers. "Bethany, please," Madison sobbed, her voice raw and unrecognizable. Thick black streaks of mascara ran down her cheeks, ruining her flawless bridal makeup. "Please, you have to stop them. You have the trust accounts. You have the money. Pay the bank. Post their bail. Do something." I looked down at the woman who had spent her entire life treating me like an unpaid servant, a financial safety net, and a convenient scapegoat. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity. There was no lingering sense of sisterly obligation. There was only the cold, hard satisfaction of a balanced ledger. "I do not have the authority to stop a federal wire fraud investigation, Madison," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "And even if I did, I would not spend a single cent to bail out the people who tried to steal my inheritance." "But we have nowhere to go," Madison cried, her fingers digging desperately into the fabric of my suit. "The bank took the house. DeAndre is going to jail. Kinsley was just expelled. We have absolutely nothing left. You cannot just leave us on the street. We are your family. You are supposed to be loyal to your family." I stepped back, forcing her to release her grip. The word family tasted like ash in the air. Family loyalty is a two-way street, I stated, my voice echoing clearly for the remaining guests to hear. You did not care about family loyalty when you downloaded a forged quitclaim deed. You did not care about family loyalty when you spent stolen trust equity on a diamond dress and a ridiculous vow renewal to impress people who do not even like you. You only care about family now because your fraudulent credit line has officially run dry. Barbara, who had been dragging her feet near the exit, twisted her head around to glare at me one final time. Her eyes burned with a mixture of terror and unadulterated hatred. She opened her mouth to hurl one last insult, one last desperate attempt to assert her dominance. I did not give her the chance. I met my mother's furious gaze and delivered the final devastating truth. You traded your daughter for a country club membership, I said, my voice ringing out with deadly absolute finality. Consider this your final dues. Barbara's mouth snapped shut, the fight instantly drained out of her. The officers pulled her forward, pushing through the heavy glass doors and out into the chaotic, siren-filled night. DeAndre followed silently behind her, his head bowed. Madison remained on the floor, weeping hysterically into her hands, completely ignored by the crowd of high society elites who were already busy whispering and forwarding their recorded videos to the local tabloids. Kinsley sat paralyzed on the edge of the stage, clutching her expulsion notice, entirely forgotten by the mother who had always treated her as a mere accessory. I turned my back on all of them. I gripped the handle of my briefcase and began to walk. The crowd parted from me immediately. There were no hushed insults. There were no judgmental stares. There was only an absolute, undeniable respect born of pure fear. I walked down the center aisle, past the melting ice sculpture, past the tables littered with abandoned caviar, and straight through the towering glass doors of the Oakbrook Country Club. The cool night air hit my face, crisp and instantly refreshing. It carried the scent of pine and rain, washing away the suffocating heavy perfume of the ballroom. A fleet of police cruisers sat parked at aggressive angles across the grand driveway, their red and blue lights flashing rhythmically against the stone columns of the building. I watched calmly as an officer placed a hand on top of Barbara's head, guiding the former matriarch of the Caldwell family into the cramped back seat of a patrol car. The door slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud. The valet, looking entirely shell-shocked by the unfolding raid, hurriedly brought my car around to the front curb. I handed him a generous tip, sliding into the driver's seat. I placed my briefcase onto the passenger seat, the leather warm and solid against my hand. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb. In my rearview mirror, the flashing police lights grew smaller and smaller until they completely disappeared behind a curve in the road. I drove onto the main highway, the quiet hum of the engine, the only sound in the cabin. The heavy, suffocating weight that I had carried for my entire life was permanently gone. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the financial safety net. I had executed the perfect audit, balanced the books, and severed the dead weight. My wealth, my dignity, and my life were finally entirely my own. It was a flawless, total victory. The defining lesson from Bethany's journey is that self-worth can never be built on a foundation of deception or conditional family approval. For years, she endured emotional abuse from relatives who prioritized superficial status over authentic connection. By choosing to walk away and forge her own independent success, she effectively stripped her toxic family of their power. Wealth and social standing mean absolutely nothing when obtained through fraud and cruelty. Ultimately, establishing firm boundaries is not an act of vengeance, but a necessary step toward personal liberation. Take a moment to evaluate your own boundaries and share your story of breaking free from toxicity in the comments below.